listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and more from across those states, as well as across the fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. First up, in COVID news in the headlines this morning, at least 4,402 new coronavirus deaths and 229,603 new cases were reported in the United States on January 12th. Over the past week, there has been an average of almost 250,000 cases per day, 249,945 cases per day, an increase of 37% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Wednesday morning, more than 22,903,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 380,000 have died. That is a new high, Jamarl, and I'm just going to pause there for a second. What's your thought on where this is going in the coming months, and what's your thought on where we are right now? You know, just looking at this, what do you think?
5,000 by February and March a day. That's my thought. I mean, look, man, you've heard me make the argument before. At a certain point, the decision space constrains. Like, you may start from a place where you have all decisions, all sorts of things that you can do in order to moderate it and everything else, because it hasn't spread to a certain extent. But at a certain point, your capabilities of trying to corral and control become limited. And it's limited based entirely on the things that happened before and the way you let it, the people let it get out of control. At this point, I think they're praying for the vaccine. But I do think this is the beginning. I don't think 4,000 is the end point now. I think 4,000 is that continue to spread point. And at some point, we try to corral it. But I think this goes to 4,500, 5,000 within a month or two. That's grim.
I would say probably sooner. I would say within a couple of weeks is my guess. It might be a month, might be a couple of weeks. We'll see. I mean, one side of it is that the cold and flu season is effectively over, and we haven't sort of reached the point where the lines start to cross from this new strain, increasing cases despite the cold and flu season starting to bring them, starting to bring them down. We're not out of it yet by any means, but we're kind of out of the peak of that. But, there's a lag between when new cases kick in and when people start to die from this. I'll ask you another follow-up question. Do you think we're going to reach a point where it's not 5,000 deaths a day, but 10,000 deaths a day? Or do you think that's not in the books tomorrow?
I mean, it depends on the mutation. If that mutation gets to the point where it spreads and get worse, and if it gets deadlier, I mean, they often say mutations get less deadly over time, like eventually becomes like a cold. Even though it may start off pretty deadly. It depends on the mutations and whether those mutations get worse. And it also depends on whether or not the vaccines become ineffective. If they're putting out vaccines to the tune of like tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people, well, at some point, the public should reach a saturation point of inoculation. But if it mutates, I'm not undercutting this idea that the mutation mutates in a way where the vaccine doesn't necessarily apply. But hopefully it doesn't get there. And hopefully, this is an inflection point where the number of vaccines cut down the rate or the ability for the virus to spread. Hopefully it gets there. Even the vaccine thing, I'm a little concerned with, though. Because, they've just recently found that mRNA vaccines could potentially be a cure, it looks like, for multiple sclerosis. And for other viruses or diseases, for example, kidney failure. If that is an autoimmune disease, could they use the mRNA process to try to prevent it in the same way or the similar way they were able to prevent the body or the immune system from attacking the cells for multiple sclerosis? The technology is phenomenal in regards to where it could go. By the same token, let's be honest, it is new technology. And we will have to kind of watch the population and see where it goes. The population right now is somewhat of a petri dish. But it's that way because, 400,000 people have dropped dead, and nearly 4,000 are dying a day. So at this point, I would say...
Over 4,000.
Yeah.
No, over 4,000. Is it 4,400 this morning. You might might have said that.
Yeah, I would just say it's warranted. I mean, the vitamin D therapy, the drug therapy that prevented the transmission or slowed, that there was a rate of slowing the rate transmission. I would say all of that should be viable in one day. It's massive.
It is. And here's another way of looking at this. If I'll call it 23, almost 23 million, because it'll be there tomorrow with the rise in cases. It's 22,900,000 right now. It'll be over 23 million tomorrow. If that's about 1 in every 15 Americans, and again, these are just numbers for the United States, that's about 1 in every 15 Americans having been infected with this. That is looking at this, not returning to herd immunity as a sort of viable epidemiological strategy to plan out in advance. It's not like you're aiming for herd immunity and that's your only line of defense against the virus. But that's still not anywhere near enough to attain herd immunity. Even if every one of those people has sufficient immunity to not get it again and not spread it, that's still, 1 in every 15 people is nowhere near enough. So between the vaccines and between some people having built up immunity, we might reach that point at some point later this year. There is definitely a possibility of that. But until we get there, it's going to be a bloody road, and it's not going to be a good one. Anyway, we have other headlines to get to, but former Bolivian President Evo Morales has tested positive for COVID-19, and there is now a third Democratic lawmaker that has tested positive following the Capitol riot last week. As reported yesterday, House Democrats Bonnie Watson-Coleman and Pramila Jayapal tested positive, and now Illinois Congressman Brad Schneider has announced his diagnosis. During the riots, lawmakers took shelter in a secure room with staff, and as a result, the congressional doctor advised everyone to get tested. After they got tested, these three have been newly infected. Warp Speed officials said in a Tuesday press briefing that they will now increase the number of doses available to states and jurisdictions, ditching the current strategy of holding back half of available doses to reserve them for the second round of the 2-dose immunizations. In national political news, yesterday the House of Representatives approved a resolution with a 223 to 205 vote to call on Vice President Mike Pence and the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment to the Constitution to declare President Trump as unable to serve. Pence has already said he will not do so. He was among those forced to take shelter inside the Capitol complex during the attack. But again, as before the vote, said that he would take no such action, leaving lawmakers with impeachment as their only option to remove Trump from office before January 20th, when President-elect Joe Biden is set to be sworn in as president. Trump faces a single charge of, quote, incitement of insurrection, end quote. After months of uncertainty, New York City's Department of Education announced yesterday that the city's Accelerated Gifted and Talented program, a single test entry system into academically advanced opportunities, will end after this year. The standardized test begins at age 4, and those who oppose the program say that the admissions model favors families of means who are better able to prepare for the test, and that the exam serves as a poor marker of talent in young children. Critics argue that the programs are not reflective of the city's larger racial portrait and need to be remade. Asian students account for 43% of gifted and talented students, followed by whites at 36%, Hispanics at 8%, and African Americans at 6%. A DOE spokesperson said this will, quote, this will be the last year New York City administers this kindergarten test. For our youngest learners, we must move forward and develop a system that reimagines accelerated learning and enrichment. At the same time, we want to honor the fact that families have been planning kindergarten admissions for many months now, end quote. Before we move on, a couple of interesting headlines there. Let's go back to impeachment for a second, Jamarl. How do you think that's going to happen? So, I mean, Pence clearly is not going to be doing the 25th, but when they vote on impeachment, I could very well see that going through. What's your take?
It may go through, and it should go through. The Senate is going to be the catch. Some Republicans in the House have basically said, yeah, this has gone too far. Again, I keep making the point, Donald Trump, this wasn't Donald Trump just saying this stuff in the ether out there somewhere where it doesn't affect them. And many times, under normal circumstances, these guys go through life unaffected by the decisions and the choices that they make. So now you have basically a mob attacking them, having them running, terrified, trying to get to somewhere to get to safety. Yeah, you might have some Republicans that have some feelings about that. Maybe not even from this notion of, hey, this guy tried to overturn the election. This guy tried to destroy America. They may have it just from their own personal safety reasons. Hey, I didn't like the fact that a mob was jazzed up by Donald Trump coming to get me. You have some Republicans who are basically saying, yeah, we'll do it. And from my standpoint, this is just. You should impeach Trump over this. How could you not? And this is coming from somebody who was against the first ridiculous impeachment, who don't like Democrats at all. I think I even dislike Democrats more than I dislike Republicans. And yet, for this, they're absolutely right. How do you have a president that have basically said, when I win, and I'm going to accept all the powers and responsibility of the role, but when I lose, I'm just going to say I won again. And I'm going to destroy any notion of law, order, in order to retain power. And I'm even going to go so far as to incite a mob to try to go and attack Congress to push them to, A, stop the decertification of the results, but also to give them, what he said, courage to do what's right or something to that effect when he said that mob. No, this is right. This is one of those things where it's just the system itself is trying to defend itself from somebody who's basically trying to tear down the system. Just because Trump was doing this in live, out in public, doesn't make it any less of a putsch attempt. He tried to take over power. So yeah, it is right for them to impeach Trump over this and prevent him from ever getting power again. You could say that this is being done to humiliate him. Yes, that's probably true. You could say there's going to be a power overreach. That is also absolutely true. But it is also true that he has earned it. So whether they can get him in the Senate or not, I don't know. But Lord knows he's earned it. If this doesn't deserve impeachment, nothing does.
I agree, frankly. You know what? Back to headlines here. In international news, Estonian Prime Minister Jüri Ratas announced on Wednesday he was resigning in the wake of a corruption scandal around Tallinn's real estate development. Earlier this week, Estonia's public prosecutor's office said it suspected the Centre Party, which he chairs, and 5 individuals in that party of being involved in a corruption case. The party allegedly received financial support in return for approving a €39 million loan that Estonia's state credit agency, Credex, provided to the Porto Franco real estate development company. The outgoing prime minister stressed that despite taking political responsibility for the loan scandal, he was not fully informed about all the details. Kuwaiti Prime Minister Sabah Khaled Al-Hamad Al-Sabah on Wednesday submitted his resignation to the country's ruler, Nawaf Al-Ahmad Al-Jabar Al-Sabah. On Tuesday, members of the Kuwaiti government tendered their resignation en masse in light of differences with the parliament. The move comes days after over 30 lawmakers submitted a motion to question the premier over a number of issues, including the composition of the cabinet. According to Kuwait's government communications office, the move was made, quote, in light of developments in the relationship between the National Assembly and the government, end quote. However, the office did not comment on the details of that resignation. The decision comes just a month after that cabinet was formed. And in New Zealand, a man smashed the glass front doors of New Zealand's Parliament building with an axe early Wednesday morning. The 31-year-old man appeared at the Wellington District Court Wednesday morning for intentional damage and possession of an offensive weapon, the spokesperson said. The motive for the attack is unclear, and police declined to comment further, citing the ongoing court case. Threats to New Zealand's Parliament are relatively rare, and there is minimal security around the legislature. The grounds are open to the public. Office workers frequently have lunch on the grass in front of the building, and children play in the nearby playground. So there was ample opportunity. There was access for this guy. But how exactly it relates to the court case, unknown. And our last headline here, French President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday pointed to the excessive competition in the European space industry and called for larger investments, noting that Paris would allocate 100 million euros for space projects in the next 2 years. Macron said during his visit to Ariane Group Aerospace, quote, in terms of economic recovery, we have decided to invest 100 million euros in space, which will cover innovations related to carrier rockets, speed up our projects, and the entire industry, end quote. The French leader then emphasized the urgency to reduce competition within Europe. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are going into a break. We will be back in just a minute on the other side of this break with our Fault Line Soapbox segment and Jamarl's monologue. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Yo, Deshaun, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our stations in Washington, D.C. If you're in the area, you can catch us radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. John Wayne had a quote that I absolutely love, and I'm going to repeat. I didn't vote for him, but he's my president, and I hope he does well. I'm going to add in a caveat to that. I hope he does well serving the interests of the American public. And I suppose I feel that way about Joe Biden. I didn't vote for Joe Biden. No, Joe Biden didn't get my vote, didn't get my support. I vilified him and attacked him viciously, especially, honestly, in the things that he said, in the things that he did, in the career that he's had over the 47 years. Loyal opposition, patriot, whether it was at times vitriolic or not, it was always true. I will continue that, even though I hope I was entirely and completely wrong. I do want the president to do well for this country. I don't want this country falling into some kind of despotic regime because the Democratic Party was so tone deaf that any random Republican takes it and they just go along in this kind of good night to America. I don't want that. I don't think anybody necessarily wants that. But is that something we can sleepwalk in? Absolutely, yes. Was that something that we barely missed this time? Absolutely, yes. Again, I make the point that just because Donald Trump was screaming of insurrection live on television and on Twitter doesn't make it any less an attempt to take power and subvert this country with all of its flaws and defects. I'll tell you this, an insurrection would not have made it better. Well, some of the Republicans have started to add their names to the list of calling for Donald Trump's impeachment and saying, yes, we will put our name on that. It's still somewhat unknown in the Senate. And while this is taking place, I think at this point, attention, at the very least from the standpoint of lefties and the public, needs to, in some level, go to what is Joe Biden going to do in that office. Joe Biden is going to be taking office in less than, a week, 2 weeks at this point. And the question becomes, what are we to expect? News bubbled up, happily, I would say, in a weird way, that Joe Biden was considering tapping Sanders as his labor secretary, but he didn't necessarily want to do it because he was concerned that the person who was coming in would not be able to get that seat. Interesting. Very interesting, considering some of the other people that Biden tapped for various positions. I like to say that people are policy, and what does it mean if that was true? Sanders is going to be sitting atop the Budget Committee. Now, this is a powerful perch for Sanders because it allows him to be in charge of budget reconciliation. Now, this was the thing that allowed Obama to get the Affordable Act through when he lost his majority in the Senate. This is very interesting. Sanders, at this point, has said that he is going to be extremely aggressive in pushing various policies out there in regards to taxes and spending and so forth. And involved in regards to a stimulus that is going to come out. Sanders is basically saying now that he is the person who's in charge of this committee, he is pushing to aggressively push out another stimulus package. This is fascinating. So right here, the Republicans were terrified of Sanders getting this position and even used this as some of their argumentation when they were out there doing debates saying, hey, if we lose the Senate, Sanders is going to take it. Well, you should have thought about that when you guys were denying the $2,000 checks. If you honestly believe that the Republicans who are in these various states who have also lost their jobs, being a Republican doesn't necessarily mean they didn't lose their jobs, and who also have medical bills, who also have their businesses shut down, if you don't think that those people, those Republican again, is an extension of the human being comes first, their needs, their lacks. If you don't think that they want $2,000 and they will have some kind of feelings seeing Mitch McConnell stopping them, then you are insane. Maybe you should have backed that $2,000 if you wanted to keep the Senate. You didn't do that. Democrats usurped the Senate from McConnell. Chuck Schumer is now ahead of that, and Sanders ahead of the Budget Committee. So right here, this is the New York Times. Sanders said he would move quickly in his new role to push through a robust and deficit finance economic package soon after President-elect Joe Biden takes office. I believe that the crisis is an enormous severity and we've got to move as rapidly as we can, Mr. Sanders said in an interview. Underline the word aggressive, he said. Start out there. I like that talk. The question becomes, what does it mean? What does it mean? And will Joe Biden go along with it? The reality of it is, if there was any time for a president to be willing to knock it out of the park, to be willing to etch his name in history as this is the president that stopped America from sliding into an abyss. This is the president that dealt with COVID-19. This is the president that not only dealt with COVID-19, but dealt with the underlying structural issues of the capitalistic system, using COVID-19 as an excuse to do so. When severity and problems hit, those are opportunities for disaster capitalism, yes, but also for actual, and it doesn't have to be disaster capitalism, you can also do it as a way, in the way that FDR did, to try to remedy some of the rough and structural issues associated with your economic system. And my hope is that even though Biden is a capitalist every bit as much as Nancy Pelosi, is a Wall Street Democrat every bit as much as pretty much the other Democratic Party, is against many of these policies like Medicare for all or the expansion of Social Security and whatnot. He's against those things, or elimination of student debt. But I am hoping that this particular moment and the gravity of the moment affects Biden when he gets in the office. And with people like Sanders pulling at him, Jayapal pulling at him, the AOCs of the world pulling at him and yelling at him and screaming at him, that there's something in Biden that tilts. That this notion that, hey, nothing is going to fundamentally change gets changed in and of itself when the gravity of the problem and the gravity of the office affects him. That's a hope. I don't believe it, but there's a hope. There was a hope that when Donald Trump came in that he was going to do the same thing. Again, minuscule hope, a paucity of hope, hope of a mustard seed, but yet hope. I think that has to be there on some level if you at the very least want Joe Biden to do good deeds. Here's another part. Mr. Sanders is expected to exert heavy influence over taxes, healthcare, climate change, and several other domestic issues. That is because his role as budget chairman will give him control over a little-known but incredibly powerful congressional tool that allows certain types of legislation to win Senate approval with just a simple majority. The tool, a budget mechanism called reconciliation, allows Congress to remove some legislation without gaining 60 votes. It has become the vehicle for several major legislative efforts this century, including tax cuts by President Trump and President George Bush, and the final version of President Obama's signature health care bill. The reconciliation process will begin with lawmakers adopting a budget resolution originating in the House and the Senate budget committees, which can include directions to congressional committees on how much to increase federal spending or taxes. The nature of the process effectively gives Mr. Sanders a leading role in deciding how expansive and expensive Mr. Biden's ambitions for the new taxes and spending will be. That is phenomenal. The question is, how far is Sanders willing to push that? How aggressive is he willing to go with that? And how much leeway is Biden willing to give? That's the question. That's the question. Mr. Sanders said in an interview that he wanted an initial emergency stimulus package to be big, quote unquote. He thinks it must include an additional $1,400 in direct payment for adults and children on top of the $600 that Congress just passed, along with money for states and cities to fund coronavirus vaccine distribution, testing, and contract tracing. He also wants to create an emergency universal health program so that anyone can get medical treatment during the pandemic, whether they currently have insurance or not. That's basically Medicare for everyone with COVID-19. Mr. Sanders said he's been speaking with Mr. Biden about the scale and timing of the stimulus legislation. He said that he did not intend to try and force his long-held priorities such as Medicare for all into the relief bill. However, he does intend to test the legal bounds of how reconciliation can be used so that Democrats can pass policies that go beyond traditional budget items and address structural problems in American society. Quote, unquote. Crisis is opportunity. That's not cynical, that's just pragmatic. And in this very specific instance, it's unfortunate that somebody like Biden takes it with the paucity of his typical ideas. By the same token, there is a spark of hope, and I'm going to call it that, hope, that the people who are basically either in Congress in certain positions, especially like Sanders perched here, and what we saw from Sanders not being willing to allow the military budget to pass and using that as a reason to fight to push for $2,000, you realize Sanders doing that may have literally won the Senate for the Democrats, allowing him to take the budget committee position in and of itself. Chuck Schumer was trying to do that when Chuck Schumer was trying to get Joe Biden to say he's willing to get rid of $50,000 of college debt. Biden wasn't willing to do that, so Schumer failed in that. Making a fight out of $2,000 going directly into Americans' pockets. Yes, that is a big deal. That affects all sorts of Americans, and people will feel some kind of way about that being blocked. It is possible that they were able to take the Senate and able to take the Budget Committee exactly because of Sanders. And it seems that he's going to be using that perch in an aggressive way. What that means in the overall, I have no idea. But it does, on some level, give me a modicum, paucity, a tiny bit, a mustard seed of hope that something comes out of this, especially since my expectations for this administration were so low to begin with. Shane, what do you think? Two items, I suppose. One, that the Democrats and the Republicans, some of them, are basically lined up to impeach Trump, and they're on board for it. On the second part to this idea that, yes, Biden has basically said nothing is going to change. No, Biden hasn't put out any really big ideas. By the same token, the moment and the gravity of the moment and everything else that's been going on, meaning the number of people dead, the number of jobs, et cetera, may push him to do something greater, especially with people at his back in the House and in the Senate. What do you think? Is that too much hope? Is that me being grossly naive and even a mustard seed of hope? What do you think?
I mean, isn't Biden the guy who's recommended that we cut Social Security? Like, I guess, well, I'm coming from the sort of standard line on this one. Another way of looking at this is not just does he have a track record of trying to cut back various government programs, for better and for worse. There are different ways you can look at that. You might, there are people who we could bring on this show who would argue for cutting Social Security. But I'm just saying, if that's part of his character, if that's part of what he believes, if that's part of his personal ideology, then, that's on display. But then furthermore, the reason, as far as I can tell, that Medicare for all is not a thing in the States is it's not just ideology, because the ideologies of mass movements, including mass movements of politicians, are sort of developed to conform to the needs of the institutions that they're a part of, whether those institutions are government or certain sectors of our civilization, certain parts of our society. It seems like the reason that we don't have Medicare for all is simply that large swaths of our government and our society don't want it. And Biden seems like he fits more or less within that as part of the sort of neoliberal, neocon friendly crowd. So I don't see him going for it. Hope is generally a good thing, but unless hope is placed, in my opinion, in something where hope is warranted, then it leads to disappointment, which just leads to renewed bouts of cynicism. I think this would be faith. And I would not place your faith in Joe Biden, but that's just me. That's my response, though, Jamarl. What do you think?
It's like, don't have hope, have faith. Turn into a religious element. I feel you. I guess my thought is, I don't have any, let me say it this way. I had no belief in Donald Trump when he took that office. I thought, oh God, this is going to be horrible. And I thought, if nothing else, he was going to get rid of the TPP. I thought that was pretty much going to be the extent of what I got from Trump. He did some anti-war stuff. And so he was pretty much as bad as I thought. But I thought there was a chance that he could have bucked the trend on some of this stuff. And he could have, pushed back. He never did, per se. And so I guess my feeling is starting the same thing with Joe Biden. I feel like you got to give the benefit of the doubt at the very least in the beginning. And not hit the guy in the knees until he immediately deserves it. But I feel you. I agree with you.
He's
47 years. He has a 47-year track record. It's probably not changing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the thing. When you say give the benefit of the doubt in the beginning, we are not in the beginning of Joe Biden's political career.
Right.
We are towards the bitter end of Joe Biden's political career. Anyway, we need to go into a break. But yeah, I don't think there's too much grounds for hope here. But hey, you're right. We'll see. I don't want to completely cut off that silver lining. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us for this segment is Vanessa Beeley, an international investigative journalist. Vanessa, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Hi. Nice to be back.
Absolutely. So, aggression abroad. We've been seeing, I've been watching people's sites. I tend to follow a lot of other people who are abroad. And they were talking about attacks that were taking place in Syria, basically by Israel. There's also this oddity where Trump in his last few days have been making these kind of changes in U.S. policy. So Cuba becomes a state sponsor of terror. Iran becomes, if I'm not mistaken, they put him on like a state sponsor terror list. Basically open these guys up for basically attack by the executive branch. What do you have to say about that? You've been following this stuff as a journalist, and I follow your work. You've done exceptional work.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if you're both aware, but I've been living in Syria for the last 14 months, so this is pretty close to home. One thing I would say is I was just listening to the end of your conversation about Joe Biden. Domestically, to be honest, I can't comment. I've not really been following on that, but internationally, I can tell you that people here are holding their breath and they're preparing for war. Biden has a history of neocolonialism, neoconservatism. If you look at what I call his war party, effectively, I put out a tweet today where I said, the madmen are paving the road for the lunatics. But that's how I perceive what is going on. Trump, for 4 years, has been the economic sledgehammer in the region. He's increased and turned the economic screws, not only against Syria, but against what would be termed their friendly neighbors, particularly Iraq and Lebanon. Lebanon's economy for some time now has been in an engineered free fall. followed by the Beirut blast, of course, last year, which further decimated the economy there, but not only decimated the economy, of course, it cut off lifelines for Syria, particularly under the manufactured lockdown. However you perceive the pandemic, it caused chaos and mayhem here. And then instead of providing humanitarian relief, of course, what did Trump do? He introduced the Caesar law based on a Qatari commissioned report, again criminalizing the Syrian government and the Syrian state, but in particular President Assad, as it always does, in order to introduce really the harshest sanctions that have been seen in Syria since sanctions began. And of course, they've been in existence for some time. So in my opinion, as I said, Trump was simply the tenderizer. He was the guy who, people claim he didn't take us into any new wars, but he maintained the ones that Obama started. And effectively what he's done now is hand the baton over to Biden. That's how I perceive it. You have Pompeo effectively, just the most incredibly lunatic statement that Iran is harboring Al-Qaeda. Kivok Al-Nassian, who's a Syrian journalist and analyst, he put out the best tweet on that. He said that's like claiming the Vatican is harboring Protestants. It's insane. But I guess there are enough uninformed people that are just listening to this and thinking, all right, okay, sure, Iran are terrorists, et cetera, et cetera. So what is happening, and at the same time, Trump, of course, he's pardoning, not Julian Assange, he's pardoning the members of Blackwater that carried out the Nusra massacre in Iraq of civilians and children in 2007. To me, there's no differentiation between the parties, the same as there's no differentiation in the UK. We don't have an opposition in the UK. Now we have a leader, Keir Starmer, who just basically reinforces government policy. And in the US, what we're watching now is some kind of political theater. But effectively, as I said, Trump's administration is handing the baton over to Biden, who's setting up a war party, in my opinion, to escalate aggression inside Syria. And in fact, since Biden became president-elect, we've seen an escalation of violence inside Syria, attacks by US-trained proxy terrorist groups emanating from Al-Tanf, one of the biggest illegal American bases in the southeast, against fuel convoys, against Syrian troops on their way home for New Year's Eve. We're seeing wheat and barley being traded from the northeast, which is occupied by the US, into Iraq, depriving the Syrian people of essential food stuff for the coming winter. We're not in the really cold stuff yet. So right now, myself, I have 4 hours of electricity off, 2 on, right? In the rural areas close to me, they're lucky if they get 1 or 2 hours of electricity a day. So that's the effect. That is American aggression, multi-layered American aggression, and it will continue and escalate under Biden.
Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for using some of that electricity to be with us here. I wanted to continue, actually, the parallels that you were bringing up between the Biden administration and the outgoing Trump administration. You're talking about Pompeo. How would you see Blinken coming in as Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken coming in? If Biden was if Pompeo was a sort of constant pressure campaign against our perceived enemies overseas, consistently sanctioning, consistently saying effectively the harshest words that you can. How do you see Blinken acting out as Secretary of State in that capacity coming into the new Biden administration?
Well, I think with Blinken, of course, and I think with the majority of Biden's administration, from what I've seen, you've got, for example, a continuation potentially of the Obama drone warfare. You have Blinken in position as a neoconservative, someone that supports Israel. Kamala Harris already, laying out the budget for Israel. And I think, what you have, I actually tweeted something out today. Pompeo is talking about war against Iran. In my opinion, they're not stupid enough to go to into full-out war against Iran, because I mean this would end up in nuclear warfare potentially, and it would end up with America receiving the aggression that it puts out all the time, in my opinion. Right? Iran is not Libya, it's not Iraq, it's not even Syria. It's way more powerful. So I think that the intention is to attack what they perceive as Iranian influence in the region, and Syria is still the main target. Why? Because Syria stands between Israeli-American supremacy in the region, and add to that the Turkish involvement. Turkey, of course, is a NATO member state under the control, more or less, of the US, although Erdogan is a rogue element in himself with Ottoman Empire aspirations. So you would then have a Muslim Brotherhood Zionist combination dominant in the region, right? And that is very much, I believe, that's Blinken's policy, that's Kamala Harris's policy, is to remove Syria from the equation as an independent, still strong state because it has the support of Iran and of Russia, and to remove the Iranian influence. So Iranian affiliates on the ground in Syria and Iraq will be the targets. I've also been talking about the potential of a false flag along the lines even of 9/11. I do believe that leading up to the inauguration of Biden, we may well see some kind of major smoking gun escalation point in the region in order to enable the escalation of aggression against Syria in particular. In my belief, this is just my opinion, I believe Syria is still the target. Iran may be used as the bait, if you like, in the sense that we have to remove Iranian influence. Iran is too strong in Syria, it's too strong in Iraq, it's too strong in Yemen. You know, we're seeing the same thing in Yemen. That's maybe why the Houthis are being designated terrorists by an outgoing Trump administration, right? This is all pointing at the escalation of conflict. But the escalation of conflict will not be direct with Iran.
Interesting. So the thought is they're going to go after Iranian proxies, or what they call Iranian proxies, in the region.
Yeah. I mean, you know, this is insane. I mean, Iranian proxies, the PMU in Iraq are Iraqi.
Right. They've
been given help by Iran because America refused to help them in their fight against ISIS. The same thing in Syria. America trained and equipped Al-Qaeda, it trained and equipped ISIS, it enabled them to flourish inside Syria. So it opened the door to Iran to come in and to defend not only Syrian interests, but of course to prevent the terrorist scourge passing the borders of Syria and heading towards Iran, which is one of the main reasons also that Russia has got involved. There are Chechen rebels and terrorists fighting here in Syria.
Can we get into that for a moment? Because you're right about that. And, you know, the New York Times, even after Obama went out of office, left office, they write this report. It's like that they should have wrote a long time before. They wrote that report. That basically that the $1 billion program that Trump admitted, and this is the supporting of terrorists in that particular region. I mean, multiple reports came out about this, meaning it was known that we were backing, training, and supporting terrorists. I mean, this was something that we did in Libya to this kind of effect of, Gaddafi is attacking his quote-unquote people. We have to have an air raid. And then they used the same thing in Syria. Can you explain that? So basically there was a civil war, or there was this kind of conflict, let's say protests or whatever, and the elements outside of the country basically inflame and drop in fighters, weapons, munitions, et cetera, and inflame that into basically a civil war, and use that as this kind of almost pretext to try to take down a side and dump like $1 billion into doing it. You were on the ground in Syria for a very long time while this was taking place, or at the very least around the time it was taking place. So let's do this. Let's take you out a little bit early, and I can bring you back in just to give you a full-throated response. We only have like a minute left in the segment. Thank you, Shane. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice you're hearing is Vanessa Beeley, an international investigative journalist. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our stations in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Vanessa Beeley, an international investigative journalist. You can follow her on Twitter at Vanessa Beeley and read her articles on MintPress.com and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, before we left, I asked about this idea of how did all of this start? Meaning, basically, we were told that there was a conflict in Syria, that there was protests against the government. And then this quickly escalated to what became called the Civil War. And within the context of this, it seemed that we were dropping money, weapons, fighters, whatever we could to basically take down and get rid of Assad. Now, the New York Times comes out with this after Obama starts to leave office, where they talk about, hey, we paid like $1 billion to try to take down Assad in this kind of golly gee way. Can you talk about that program and talk about basically the damage that caused? I mean, 500,000 people died in that conflict. That was one of the good things that Donald Trump actually brought attention to. I mean, mind you, he was doing it to hit Obama. And even Fox News, oddly enough, brought attention to it. But again, they were using it to hit Obama. Like, oh, golly gee, Obama was dumping all of this money to these terrorists. So how did this start? And can you give us just this, I guess a small understanding or summary of how this started and how this escalated to the way it ended up?
I think you have to go back to, I'll go through it very, very quickly, but this was not a civil war. This was a fomented insurgency using the Muslim Brotherhood as a perennial battering ram against Syria. Of course, that had happened previously in the late 70s through to 1982 when Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, put down the insurrection in Hama in 1982 after the Muslim Brotherhood had carried out a series of attacks on civilians and suicide bombings, etc., very similar to what's happening now. But if you go back to 2003 and you look at the communications between Bush and Blair during, in fact, even as far back as 9/11, 2001, just after, where they talk about trying to create a different relationship with Syria, but otherwise, of course, what they're intimating is that they will do in Syria what they did in Iraq. If you look or listen to Jeffrey Sachs when he talks about the CIA operations, Operation Timber Sycamore, Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister, in 2013 spoke about the fact that in 2009, British ministers and intelligence had spoken to him and told him that they were planning to finance chosen opposition in Syria to overthrow the Syrian government. And then, of course, we know that President Assad refused to relinquish Palestinian rights. He refused to accept the US Qatari-backed pipeline. He went instead for the Iranian-Russian option. He was developing relations with China, the 5 Cs project, the Silk Road, etc. In other words, he was threatening, heaven forbid, to be a strong independent state, a reformist state, according to former British ambassador who was in Syria 2003 to 2006, Peter Ford. He threatened US-Israeli supremacy in the region, and of course his alliance with Iran and even with Russia. America for sure saw the writing on the wall that through Syria, Russia would develop a strong Middle Eastern base to compete with American unipolarity. So it was never a civil war, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the majority of the Syrian people that I speak to who are now back under or living in the 85% of the territory that's back under Syrian government and state control. And of course also the Department of Intelligence Agency documents that also showed that this entire project had been planned for some time. And Wesley Clark, of course, talking about the 7 countries that would be taken out. Syria was included in those. So, going back through the timeline leading up to this conflict, this regime change conflict that has been waged against the Syrian people for the last 10 years, it was planned well in advance. And the power multiplication, the sending in of weapons, the supply of media support. I mean, the recent document leak of the UK Foreign Office, involvement in the media support and promotion of the armed groups, including Al-Qaeda affiliates inside Syria. And of course, the UK, in my opinion, has been running the intelligence operations against Syria since before the war started. The US has provided much of what I call the muscle. It's provided a lot of the military assistance on the ground. I mean, you have to ask yourself, how did ISIS end up with some of the most sophisticated state-of-the-art Toyota trucks? I mean, that has been investigated and the information is out there. But America effectively,
Independent came out with I believe it was the Independent, came out with an article on that, asking how on earth did ISIS and the terrorists get their hands on weapons and military gear like this? And they were like, the investigation came that only the United States. Yeah. It was astonishing. Like, it's an astonishing report to read.
Yeah. And you talk about Trump. Okay. I will hesitatingly say that Trump didn't massively escalate things here, but he's maintained it. He's maintained Obama's war. He's the one that's been recycling ISIS from Syria into Iraq, retraining them, re-equipping them, reinforcing them, and then sending them back into the American base at Al Tanaf in the southeast on the Jordan border, and also using the Rukban refugee camp, which is a recruitment and training ground for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. For me, look, these monikers mean nothing. Effectively, these terrorist groups act and behave like mafia groups. In other words, they're ideologically the same. They fight over status, over power, over weapons, over money, over territory. That's it. That's the only difference between them. And they're pretty much all supported, promoted, and funded by the US coalition. Now, it's interesting to note that around Al Tanaf and Rukban, there is a 25-kilometer no-go zone for Syria and Russia, despite the fact that it's Syrian territory. But Syria and Russia are not allowed to enter into that territory. They're under protection of the US. And recently, the US has been running HIMAR, forgotten what that stands for, but it's the ground-to-air missile operations in those exercises in those areas with the armed groups. I mean, the brazenness of U.S. aggression inside Syria is quite extraordinary, and that has continued, and it has been actually multiplied under Trump. Okay, he can argue that he was lied to about the number of troops that are actually inside Syria. But effectively, they increased their military footprint under Trump's administration. So as I said to you before, I don't really swallow this kind of Trump did this and Biden will do that. I just think it's a roadmap, and each president has his part to play on that journey along that roadmap. And the end of that roadmap is the devastation of Syria, the reduction down to a failed state. Now, I don't think they're going to achieve that because of the Russian presence now inside Syria, of the Iranian presence inside Syria, and of course Hezbollah presence inside Syria. And all of those countries, including China, know the importance of maintaining Syria's territorial integrity. So this is a very different war to the American war against Iraq or against Libya or even against Venezuela or further afield. This is a very different war.
Let's get a little bit more into that, Vanessa. Why has Assad been so relatively resilient compared to the other targets of the Arab Spring? Is it the support from these other countries like you're talking about? What would you chalk that up to?
Well, I mean, if you go back to 2012, I think it was Jonathan Steele, who was still at The Guardian at that point, before The Guardian got completely overrun by spooks. in my opinion. And Jonathan Steele wrote a brilliant article, it's still available, where he said the one thing that the media is not talking about is the popularity of President Assad. And of course, you talked about the mainstream media coverage of the so-called uprising, but the mainstream media never covered the massive marches that came out in support of President Assad. Syria could not have survived 10 years of terrorism, economic sanctions, the devastation of infrastructure, political and information war, diplomatic war against them, without the stability of the Syrian state and without the support of the Syrian people inside Syria for their president. And of course, we shouldn't forget that we have elections in Syria coming up this year. And that's why, in my opinion, I feel this year is going to be a pivotal year. And it's no mistake or coincidence that Biden is now in power. Do I fear for Syria? I fear for the escalation for the people of Syria, yes. Do I think that Syria will withstand this intensity of escalation? Yes, I do, because of its allies and because of the strength and resilience of the Syrian people themselves. I've lived among them, even though they're tired, they're exhausted. I see every day 5-kilometer queues, 10-kilometer queues for fuel. They don't have gas, they don't have heating fuel. They're struggling for bread because, as I say, U.S. proxies are stealing their wheat and grain and trade cross-border trading it with Iraq and through Iraq into Turkey and even to Israel. Some of the oil we know, of course, is being sold through Turkey and to Israel. They are exhausted, but this country will never, ever allow itself to be ruled by an American-imposed regime, which would be clearly a Muslim Brotherhood regime, which would take Syria back to the Dark Ages, in the opinion of the majority of the people here.
From the standpoint of the reforms that you mentioned were being made, you said they're having elections this year. Could you talk about that? What are the electoral reforms that were instituted? And for that matter, why did they feel the need to institute them? Meaning, what was the pressure on them to push to allow those type of reforms?
At the beginning, you mean?
Right.
At the beginning of the...
At the beginning.
Right. What I would refer people to, if you don't mind, is to a brilliant article by Shameen Nawani, another journalist who has been present inside Syria since the beginning of the conflict. And she wrote a great article for RT. I think it's called, basically, Will We End Up Going Back to the 2011 Reforms? I can't, off the top of my head, run through the whole of the reforms in the Constitution. One, it would take too long, and my memory is a bit vague on it at the moment. But I would refer everyone to that article. Check it out, because what is insane is what is now basically being demanded from the Syrian government are effectively the reforms that were being put in place around 2011 in response to the demands from people inside Syria. At that time, obviously, there were some peaceful protests, and I would I would stress that there is opposition inside Syria to the government, just as there is to any government in the world. But when I speak to those opposition members, the ones that didn't take up arms, the ones that weren't financed by the West to try and overthrow the government, they have criticisms, but at the end of the day, they respect and they understand that without the stability that this government has given them, in other words, the fact that it has remained in power for those 10 years, that it has enabled supply of electricity, of essential items, despite all of the pressures it's been under, they have supported that government through the 10-year war. And that's a very important point to make. Of course, there is opposition, and that opposition will be represented.
I think we totally get your point that, the opposition itself is opposition, but they didn't necessarily agree with the takeover from outside the borders. So I totally understand where you're coming from. The voice you guys were listening to is Vanessa Beeley, international investigative journalist. You can follow her on Twitter at Vanessa Beeley and read her articles on mintpress.com and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Vanessa Beeley. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seasoned political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 4,402 new coronavirus deaths and 229,603 new cases were reported in the United States on January 12th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 249,945 cases per day, an increase of 37% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Wednesday morning, more than 22,903,300 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 380,000 have died. That number, 4,402 new coronavirus deaths, that number is extraordinary. I remember a few months ago, we were talking about it going to 2,500. It's blown past that. Former Bolivia President Evo Morales has tested positive for COVID-19. There is now a third Democratic lawmaker that has tested positive following the Capitol riot last week. As reported yesterday, House Democrats Bonnie Watson Coleman and Pramila Jayapal tested positive, and now Illinois Congressman Brad Schneider has announced his diagnosis. During the riots, lawmakers took shelter in a secure room with staff. As a result, the congressional doctor advised everyone to get tested. Basically, you had many of the Republicans that were in the room that refused to wear a mask and rioted, people handing out the mask. And now you have a situation with many of these people coming down with the illness themselves. Warp Speed officials said in Tuesday press briefing that they will now increase the number of doses available to states and jurisdictions, ditching the current strategy of holding back available doses to reserve them for a second round of 2-dose immunizations. Basically, when they first handed out the dosages, the assumption was that people would have to get 2 doses. So their thought was, okay, we'll hold 1 dose back, so when those people need to get their second dose, we'll just give them their second dose. At this point, they're basically saying, release it all. We'll figure out with the second dose when the next doses come back in, but basically get as many people immunized as possible. Not to mention that some of the vaccines are going to have 1 dose or single dose uses. But that's the thinking behind basically releasing it all. Yesterday, the U.S. House of Representatives approved a resolution with a 223-202 vote to call on Vice President Mike Pence and the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment to the Constitution to declare President Trump unable to serve. Pence, who was among those forced to take shelter in the Capitol complex during the attack, said before the vote that he would take no such action, leaving lawmakers with impeachment as their only option to remove Trump from office before January 20th, when Joe Biden is set to be sworn in as president. Trump faces a single charge of incitement of an insurrection. Shane, we talked about how I thought about that, what I thought about this kind of insurrection vote. What do you think about it? Do you think this is warranted? Do you think this is necessary? How do you process the impeachment at this point?
I don't see it as necessary. I do see it as warranted. And if it doesn't go through, I don't know what that means for Congress. And I'm not saying that to be an alarmist by any means. I'm not saying it would be catastrophic if it doesn't go through. But a lot of folks who would be voting on that, who would be voting no, as far as I can tell, were witnesses to the siege. You know, they saw what was happening. They were there at the time. They were nearby, whichever case. And so I mean, in other words, if they don't go through with that, it would be a little bit surprising to me. And this, of course, comes as that siege itself stymied the vote against confirming the electoral college votes, against confirming the electoral college ballots, because a lot of folks were like, we shouldn't push back on this too hard after the events of today. So it's not that, you know, it's a week after the event now. That's not that long to dull the memories of some of these folks. And I would think that it wouldn't be long enough to dull whatever conviction they might have had at the time. Now, of course, impeaching the president is on another order. It's another matter entirely from refusing to confirm the electoral college. But it's kind of similar. I don't know. So if that makes sense, I think that the siege will have affected how people view this whole thing dramatically and personally in a way that might, you know, lead their emotions to cause them to cast the vote. And furthermore, another way of looking at this is, I think the siege has given many Republicans who had been public supporters and private detractors of President Trump a chance to be more public in their detraction, if that makes sense. I think that, much of the base.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. While much of Trump's base is, of course, still on his side and will be for the foreseeable future, if not forever, some of his base has been chiseled off. Definitely, I have seen it happen. Even if it's not they're completely condemning their decision, even if it's not that they're publicly ceasing to support Trump, it's that they saw what he did the day of, they saw what he did leading up to it, and they can't be so wholehearted in their support of him. And so I don't think it's nearly as crucial a blow, nearly as critical a blow on these politicians' parts to their own future electability if they decided to go against this, and therefore some of them will. Now, if that's a big enough margin for them to actually impeach him, I don't know, but it might be. You know, the fact that it's in the running now is itself remarkable.
Yeah, it is. Because at first, the first impeachment, McConnell barely even, didn't even want to take it. On this one, no, you have far more Republicans that are raising their hands saying yes. Also, Fox News is taking this in a weird way. So Fox News' argument is basically, you shouldn't really impeach. I think it was killing me to make this argument because people are angry and that they're threatening to attack all 50 state houses. That basically, because Republicans and militia groups and some of these other right-wing elements are basically threatened to attack the state houses and the inauguration, that threat, that hostage taking of sorts, should be reason enough to not impeach. That's nonsense. That is lunacy. And honestly, if the federal government or if the people are making an argument or a decision not to impeach because they're terrified of attacks on state houses, or for that matter, the inauguration, then the U.S. government is ceased to be a sovereign entity. Meaning, you can't use that as a justification to not impeach. In fact, I would argue that is even more of a reason to impeach, not less of a reason to impeach. So, the threat of all of this stuff, no, that's not a reason. That is so not a reason. And honestly, there's something problematic with Fox News even making that argument. You know what I mean? Like the way they were talking about the Black Lives Matter protests and everything else. This was a siege on the Capitol. And their response on this is, hey, people are angry, and maybe this gets worse, and maybe they're going to attack all 50 state houses if you impeach. That's more of a reason to impeach Fox. Just pointing it out. After months of uncertainty, New York City's Department of Education announced yesterday that the city's Accelerated Gifted and Talented program, a single test entry system into academically advanced opportunities, will end after this year. The standardized test begins at age 4, and those who oppose the program say that the admission model favors families of means who are better able to prepare for the test, and that the exam serves as a poor marker of talent in young children. Critics argue that the programs are not reflective of the city's larger racial portrait and need to be remade. Asian students account for 43% of the gifted and talented students, followed by whites at 36%, Hispanics at 8%, and African Americans at 6%. The DOE, Department of Education spokesperson said, quote, "This will be the last year New York City administers this kindergarten test. For our youngest learners, we must move forward and develop a system that reimagines accelerated learning and enrichment. At the same time, we want to honor the fact that families have been planning kindergarten admissions for many months now," unquote. Very interesting. That is an interesting one. Shane, what do you think of that? So, for me, if you're going to put a program like this and testing like this gets really dicey. Oftentimes, the way a kid develops is, in many respects, is the perspective of the people around that kid and the expectations of the people around that kid. A parent, let's say there was a lawyer and a doctor. Let's use the Cosbys, for example. They have a kid. There's an implicit pressure on those kids at all times that those kids may not even notice, but it's there. That pressure is, my mom and dad did X. They went to school for X amount of time. They make X amount. They have these political connections. They have these connections within the context of whatever particular establishment. And that kid unknowingly absorbs that stuff. This is just the way of life. This is just how life is. Well, the same thing is true from the standpoint of dirt poor parents. It's not that the kid is worse. It's not that the kid is a lack or inability to learn. It's that the environments are different and the environments enrich or undermine the talent. There's also something to be said for the way that other people perceive those kids. They have done experiments on this stuff. If you have an environment where you expect the kid to succeed, the kid has a much better chance of success, as opposed to the expectation of the kid to fail, where the kid has a higher chance of failure. My fear or my concern with this is, if you have a class like this, and you start off early like this, and you're creating these distinctions in these boxes, what are you basically evaluating before you put a kid at the age of, 4? For something like this? And what does it mean for kids going forward in regards to the way they perceive themselves? I don't know. What do you think about this, Shane? I know you have strong feelings about the schooling system. You were homeschooled, and so you see this a little bit differently than I do at times. How do you see this particular program and the ending of this program, and what do you think about it?
I did. Here's the thing. I did go to school briefly, both in preschool, very early grade years, and then I was taken out. I was homeschooled / unschooled for years. Then I went back into it. So that's just, I have been to school, and then I got out. I tested out, got my a GED equivalency thing. Started going to community college when I was 14, 15 years old. So I've kind of had a weird parallel track in some ways, but had my own path. I saw people who didn't get into the gifted and talented program in the school that I went to during my middle school years. A couple of them. I saw people who didn't get in, who deserved to get in. And frankly, I saw people who got in, who, compared to people who shouldn't have been there. So I don't think it's perfect. I think the fact that a lot of kids, for instance, the fact that ADHD, I believe that that's a genuine thing. I don't know what causes it. I'm pretty cautious about over-treating it, in my opinion, pharmacologically. So, I think there's a reason to have scruples there, definitely. And the fact that, frankly, I don't think we have a way to test children at this point. We don't have standardized tests that can actually create a reasonable standard, create a useful standard for who has high potential in different areas. I think that is itself a deep complication. So a single entry test is going to be problematic. A multi-entry test is going to be problematic. I think in general, our whole education system is kind of sclerotic. It's built up on these backlog approaches to how you're supposed to evaluate people and educate them. I think the whole nature of education, there have been many books written about the nature of modern education, where it comes from, a lot of good lines of argument there. So yeah, I do have deeper problems with this. But one of the big things that you're saying, and of course what this gets directly to, is if you have these maintained differential advantages between generations, where parents, regardless of their individual cognitive skills, regardless of their general potential as human beings, if those parents are wealthy, if they've gotten to be wealthy, sure, there might be some advantages internally that lead them to get to attaining those positions of wealth, but a lot of this is intergenerational. And then if they keep their kids in that position and get their kids to the head of the pack when it comes to these programs, either by training them or by other and more covert means, then that's problematic, I would say, as a society. That is, if the point of these programs is sort of meritocratic, where you're, rewarding the truly best, or at least giving them, not even rewarding, but giving them the fullest opportunity to express their potential in society. If the point is that, then I don't think we're doing that right now. So I'm curious to see what they come up with as a replacement for this. You should have some sort of alternative tracks to handle people who are better in different ways and who are underperforming in other ways. But I don't know. It's all in the midst.
Age of 4? Like 4 just seems
4 years old.
Obscenely, like, what do you get at that
Young.
age? I mean, like, I don't know what. I mean, like, can you get an honest track of intelligence at the age of 4 that could make a determination on who should be and where? And it's like, what are you gauging at that point? Are you just gauging the economic well-being of the various families and the capabilities of those families to basically push those kids forward? I'm like, I don't know.
One other way of looking at this, I was just very briefly, we got to close out headlines here, but maybe there shouldn't be a single type of gifted program, because that creates a simple hierarchy of evaluating your school children, where by default, gifted kids, quote unquote, are better than standard kids in some ways. And that's too simple. That's way too reductionistic when it comes to the full spectrum of what human beings are capable of. So that's a simple take, but that's one other thing to throw in here. And you're right, 4 is pretty damn young. You can see some differences at that age.
Yeah, I mean,
that's
you might
true,
be able to see differences, but are you going to be able to see differences where this particular, for example, like I was in advanced classes when I was in high school and when I was in middle school. And it's kind of advanced, but is it really? I mean, like, it didn't seem to be that drastically different. And things that I was interested in, I could master. I don't need, and my mom used to say, dude, not everybody in the class is going to accept it like that. On things that I'm not interested in, I'm horrible at and have a difficult time getting. So I understand this notion that some kids can be better at some things and some kids can be better at other things. And this kind of one track just seems too singular to kind of make that work. And 4 just seems so abysmally low to get any kind of real idea on who's going to master what. I don't know. I don't know. I could be entirely wrong on this because, clearly I don't have, I'm not read in the subject, so fair enough. But
and one last note. I was in the program too. None of my friends were. Most of the kids who were in the program were like sort of trained children. It felt like they were trained children who were coming from upper class backgrounds. Most of my friends were from outside of that. And at least as smart, on a par with the kids who were in the program.
Yeah,
so again,
I didn't see this drastic difference in intelligence. I mean, especially when we started playing chess and those type of things. Like, it's just like from software, all of these different things. And I didn't see this drastic difference in intelligence. I saw a difference in interests. And there's a difference in those things. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's come out of this. Those are your headlines, or let's say we've already done the headline one. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tells you more. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest. We're joined by Vasudevan Sridharan. He is an experienced journalist based in South India who writes on current affairs, geopolitical equations, the environment, startups, and the economy. His works have appeared in several Indian and global publications, and you can follow Vasudevan on Twitter at Vasu_Sridharan. Vasudevan, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning? No, we have you. I think you might be muted for a second here. Let's try to bring you back in. Vasudevan, you there? We do not apparently have him. No, sad to say. Well, we're talking about what's going on in India, specifically with the ongoing farmer strikes. We had him on before to talk about this. Recently, there was a Supreme Court decision by India's Supreme Court, effectively ruling against the way the central government in India had handled these new reforms, and it'd be an interesting conversation if we can bring them on.
Well, I can read
Jamarl.
through the New York Times piece on this that I was reviewing yesterday for the interview. The decision by the India's High Court on Tuesday to temporarily suspend the implementation of new farming laws at the center of the huge protests appeared unlikely to end a weeks-long slowdown choking New Delhi, as protesting farmers declared that the suspension is a politically motivated trick to ease the pressure on the government and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, the Supreme Court said it was halting the market-friendly laws until a committee of experts appointed by the court could consult with government officials and protesting farmers to try to find a solution to the dispute. Dispute is putting it mildly. I mean, we're talking about like millions of people protesting, like this kind of ungodly number of people protesting new laws. That's astonishing. Like when you think about that, I mean, the number of people who are protesting is about like a third of the United States, something to that effect. Like the numbers were phenomenal. You're talking about like the tens of millions of people who are basically saying no and bringing India to a halt in repudiation of the government. The question becomes, what happens next after this? I always think that action begets action. That the moment that people start to feel their power, they start to use their power in different ways in regards to trying to deal with the societal issues. Now that the farmers realize that they can bring the government to a halt, that they actually have the power, that the population itself is empowered when the population demands or needs itself to be that way, what happens next? Do they make further demands? Does the demands escalate? Does it force the government into reforms to kind of cut down on the number of people who are out there protesting? This is the yellow vest stuff again. You had a huge number of people protesting. You have 70% of the population that agree. What does the French government do? The French government says, let's go into negotiations. Because basically the government is a small group, whereas the protesters, it takes tens of thousands to continuously do it over and over and over again. It takes massive amounts of energy. And so the power structure knows that, and the power structure likes to take it out longer. How long can we make this go? How long can we stretch out their inability or their ability to come out like this and the numbers that they can come out like this? And then you take a second thing, reform. All right, we're going to issue this reform or that reform. And just enough to get more people off. Meaning it seems that...
Now, here we have him on.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. But I think that's
what don't mean to cut in too harshly here. But
yeah, for Narendra. Oh, please continue, Shane.
But yeah, Vasudevan, do we have you with us now?
Yeah, I think I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly well. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, we've only got a couple of minutes. We've got maybe 6-7 minutes to get into the conversation. So let's do it. Last time we had you on, massive strikes were ongoing. It's a little bit later now. The Supreme Court has just come out with a decision that's friendly to the case of the farmers protesting against the Indian government. Can you just tell us what are the contents of that case? How are the strikes/protests going? What's the state of play there? Vasudevan.
At the outset, it might look friendly to the farmers, but what the farmers are saying, the Supreme Court has ordered to form a panel of 4 members. That's pretty much the backbone of the entire order. That although they have temporarily suspended the 3 farm laws, but the central one is they've installed 4 panel members. All of them have expressed support to the government and the farming laws in the past couple of years. At least one of them has been expressing support to deregulate the farming sector for the past 20 years. So this is pretty much in support of the government. So farmers are not entirely happy with the order. They've openly stated today that they will not engage with a panel ordered by the Supreme Court. So it's pretty much the statement what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. There's not much improvement on this one.
I'm curious, is there a brain trust? Is there a leadership from the standpoint of the farmers and the protests? I mean, it's so many people that are out there protesting. How are they organizing this? And do they have some representative or something that can go and negotiate in regards to what they want? Or is it just a mass of people basically giving demands and saying, this is what we want?
Oh, there are several key leaders, especially from Punjab and Haryana. They have been engaging with the government. They are the ones who are spearheading the protest. Definitely, there are several key leaders. There are umbrella organizations. There are unions and other forms of organizations in various states. So those are represented by the umbrella bodies. They are talking. This is not entirely, although the farming agriculture sector is fragmented hugely in India. There are some form of structures in place. So they are engaging with the government.
Okay, so there is a sort of established intellectual elite on the farmers' side that's engaging with the Supreme Court, with the government. What's their influence on this chosen panel? I'm guessing this panel, is there any chance this panel can be reformed? You said, again, all four of the people on this panel have expressed their support in recent years for these reforms. Is there any way for them to, change the makeup of that panel, or is that set in stone at this point? Vasudevan?
Oh, that's set in stone. They can't change it. That's why the farmers have openly said today that they will not engage with the panel.
And how is that being received politically? How is in terms of the national political news, if the farmers are refusing to work with that panel, how is the Indian press, how is the Indian government chosen to respond to that?
This is casting aspersions on the highest judicial court in India. We have seen in the last at least 7 or 8 years, there are several allegations, some of them proven, some of them are not, saying that the ruling government is coercing the Supreme Court, or at least the highest judiciary in some form or other. So this is again proving this, saying at least the Supreme Court has ruled, or at least temporarily, in favor of the government through convoluted ways, although not directly. Although we must point out the Supreme Court has chosen some very harsh words for the government, especially in yesterday's ruling, saying that we don't want blood on our hands. The government is showing a sort of apathy to the farmers' plight. So it's pretty much through the opposition, the media, and others do take it with a pinch of salt, a large pinch of salt, in fact.
How do you think this turns out? I mean, the farmers have basically said, we're not negotiating with this process. This is not giving us what we want. They even made the point that the ruling gives basically a pause, a moment of respite to the government. So how do you expect this to kind of turn out? I mean, if the farmers aren't going anywhere, do you think that would have enough political force to, let's say, overcome the political ossification of what they're trying to get accomplished?
The ruling government is pretty much extremely cautious of the image it projects. Although they might not be worried about the protests, they haven't seen similar kind of protests in the last 7 or 8 years. Although some of them were sporadic, erratic, but not this kind. This is extremely organized. We do see kitchens have been set up. There have been pharmacies. We are getting newsletters every day from the protest side. So this is pretty much a small city established, a functioning city established near the capital. So the ruling government does not want to do it. It does not want to be seen as anti-farmer. So one of them should cave in. We do not know which one it will be. It doesn't look like it's going to be the farmers for now.
And so Vasudevan, another way of approaching this. Many farmers protesting. My guess is there's a lot on the line for this. I'm curious, for the Indian government, how much is on the line for them? I'm guessing this is part of a larger sort of modernization program, which they're taking to maintain both a sort of international reputation. They're trying to, be perceived as reforming some of the more stagnant parts of their economy. Is there a direct economic incentive? Do they stand to make a lot more money, or what's on the line for the government itself?
Oh, absolutely. This is one of the most antiquated sectors. We haven't seen major agricultural reforms in the last couple of decades, major ones, although other sectors have seen manufacturing or services. So the government is determined to do it. The government also wants the private money to play a huge part in agriculture. We haven't seen similar resistance in other sectors when the government wanted to introduce private players, for example, in railways or air sector or insurance. But this is a little more organized, and this could directly impact the livelihoods of several millions of farmers. So that's always there. We haven't seen such kind of resistance in that.
And from your perspective, Vasudevan, if there is a need, I mean, we're going to push you a little bit over into the other side of the half hour just because we didn't have enough time in the last segment, clearly. If there is a need on the government's part to reform these antiquated sectors, but on the other hand, millions of farmers would potentially, their livelihoods could be seriously hurt. This is a massive issue for them. In your opinion, from what you've heard and from what you've read, is there any better way that the Indian government could have or could still handle this crisis?
Well, frankly, just like in most other cases, the ruling government could have been a little more benevolent. They have come across malevolent against any form of protest. So they haven't shown the kindness which one would expect, especially when several thousand, hundreds of thousands are protesting. So that's one key point. They haven't. They've said they are ready to amend the laws. And firstly, of course, the first one is a huge mistake. They haven't discussed enough with the farmers or major unions before implementing the laws. That's always there. That's the primary one. But after the protests broke out, they could have been a little more benevolent towards protesters.
Okay. All right. I get what you're saying there. You know what? We're out of time here. Vasudevan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. Take care.
You too. For those listening, that was Vasudevan Sridharan. He is an experienced journalist based in South India who writes on current affairs, geopolitical equations, the environment, startups, and the economy. His works have appeared in several Indian and global publications, and you can follow him on Twitter at Vasu_Sridharan. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be back in just a minute talking about the pushback against Nigeria's special anti-robbery squad, the SARS protests that have been going on also for months now. You're listening again to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are joined by our guest, Nanre Nafzagir. She is a Pan-Africanist activist and scholar that you can keep up with on Twitter at Rhoda Nanre and We Are the Africa 1. Nanre, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you for being back with us. Let's talk about what's going on in Nigeria. Special anti-robbery squad protests have been taking place for months now. Effectively, the story in very simple terms before I hand it over to you to give a lot more detail is there is this special anti-robbery squad that was set up as an anti-crime unit, and that unit has apparently quickly devolved into its own sort of extortion racket, where they are themselves robbing and extorting the citizens of Nigeria. That is what the protesters are protesting here. The anti-SARS protests, to be very clear, are protesting this. They're not protesting like the SARS virus, just to be very clear. You know, with the pandemic, there's some confusing overlap potentially, but it's about this unit. Can you please give us the details? What are they actually protesting? What is the SARS, this squad, responsible for doing? Why is this coming up now? What's the story, Nanra?
So, to put it in context, the NSARS protest of I would say a historical and also a broader movement. And SARS is a particular unit that was formed in Nigeria in 1992, but it's actually part of a long history of police brutality against the Nigerian people. And the police system, of course, was set up by the colonial British state in the 19th century and has continued, and the actual Nigerian police force was formed in the early 1900s. But the Nigerian police force has continued to be in deep conflict, as many police forces are, with the people. And so the brutality of the SARS force in particular has actually amplified a long tradition of police violence, where police continue to attack poor people mostly, and now young people as well, and protect the interests of the elite, of the ruling class. Police are often stationed to protect our National Assemblymen, our Congress, the equivalent of the U.S. Congress. They are stationed to protect governors and presidents. So the police force in Nigeria has been known notoriously to protect the interests of those in power, and to also be very brutal and attacking on Nigerian people. So the SARS unit in particular, and it's always interesting to see what sparks a particular movement, what is kind of the straw, the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, that kind of unleashes tensions that have been brewing for decades. So the SARS unit in particular had a very deep impact on young people in Nigeria. And Nigeria's population is around 200 million. About 70% of these are under the age of 24. So we have a very young population. And this population in particular, this generation, has grown up in the context of deep poverty. Nigeria's poverty is over 70%. So many of these youth have grown up without basic access to water, electricity, basic access to food, housing. And so many of these young people have created their own economy. And in some ways, it has been an underground economy. So they've used the internet, they've used small businesses, they've created different businesses. And these young people have complained that SARS, this particular police unit, has discriminately targeted them for having any kind of economic potential. So when they're seen with cell phones, when they're seen with iPhones, when they're seen having a laptop or driving a nice car, this particular unit stops them, attacks them, forces them to go to ATMs, takes their money, beats them up, rapes also. There's also been a lot of cases of rape, and has really targeted this particular demographic. So in 2017, there was a call to end SARS on Twitter. It took hold, but it didn't really get amplified. And so later on in 2020, there was a particular case that was that was aired on social media, where it was filmed, the murder of some young men by the SARS unit. And this really was kind of going off the protest, even here in the U.S. in the summer, it caught fire. And protests took place across Nigeria, over 20 cities. Thousands and thousands of young people were on the streets for almost 3 weeks, until the government clamped down very hard on them on October 20th. When the military actually attacked protesters, and that led to the Lekki massacre. And the protests were effectively quelled through the month of October, and the suppression of activists and protesters continues till today.
Wow, that's wow. It's funny, being in the United States with the number of killings and so forth we have in this country, it doesn't quite touch that. I mean, for the level of gravity that has taken place in Nigeria, I especially with the extrajudicial killings and the the robberies, rapes, etc. I'm curious, what has been the response from the standpoint of government and listening to the public demand on this? I mean, I was reading through the information for this particular segment. This is pretty extreme stuff. I mean, basically, if somebody has a cell phone, they grab the person, take them to jail, force them to give them money to let them out of jail. I mean, or the extrajudicial killings in and of themselves. These things are pretty extreme. What has the government's response been to this and other units behaving in this way?
Well, the government is complicit. They're completely aware of this. I grew up in Nigeria under military rule. Very little has changed. I grew up, paying money to police officers at checkpoints. Checkpoints continue to be popular. Like what the police do is known by all, and there's no Nigerian that does not have their story about the police. So the government knows what's happening, and they're complicit. The policemen actually are also underpaid. They're often not paid. Some of the salaries actually right now have not been paid for 6 months. Their quarters, where they live is just deplorable. You would not want your worst enemy to live in the conditions that these police officers live in. So then working for the politicians is then a benefit for these policemen. So the government kind of keeps things going as it is. In terms of how the government responded to the protesters, well, I think the protests really caught them off guard because there have been protests here and there. There was the Occupy Nigeria a few years ago. There have been protests by labor movements and various different associations, but nothing to this magnitude has happened for decades. I would say since the anti-military, anti-dictatorship, pro-democracy movement in the 1990s. So I think the government was really caught off guard because they've kind of been getting away literally with murder. And they were kind of shocked that this generation was going to wake up and go on the streets in this way. So in the beginning, they started with negotiations. They were kind of trying to placate the protesters. The protesters had some demands. The government said they were meeting the demands. They said they were disbanding SARS, but actually they said that in 2017. So we were not fooled by the claim that they were going to end SARS. Then they set up another unit, which was called SWAT, which was going to be the equivalent. And so the protesters, the activists on the ground, and even globally, there were protests in Berlin, there were protests here in New York, in DC, over in Canada, in Toronto. So the government was really scared. And so when the negotiations weren't going well and the protests were continuing, the government responded with brute force. And they began killing. On October 20th, the army descended on protesters who were peaceful, sitting down, singing the Nigerian anthem, holding the Nigerian flag, and murdered them. Actually shot into the crowds with live ammunition for hours on end. And this has been reported by CNN, by Amnesty. The reports are there. And murdered protesters who were sitting and singing the Nigerian anthem. And it was devastating. Every single Nigerian was live on Instagram, on Twitter, and we were literally watching these things unfolding. People were crying, they were holding their children. This was happening live. And the funny thing was, in the next few days, the government came out and said that didn't happen, that it was a charade, that it was fake news, using the words of the wonderful American president. There was fake news, and this didn't happen. It was a stage, and nothing like that happened.
They were claiming that it was Photoshop. They were claiming that from the video footage and the photographs. Again, you're talking about the Lucky Massacre back on October 20th of last year, right?
Yes.
And this was so.
Mm-hmm.
So one quick follow-up question. Got a couple of minutes left on this side of the break, and then we'll bring you back. SARS is officially disbanded at this point. Just 8 days before the Lucky Massacre on October 12th, the Nigerian government disbanded SARS, and then, like you're saying, they replaced it with the special weapons, something like this, the SWAT team. You're saying that it's effectively the same thing. It's a continuation of the same policies. Are the same people being hired? In other words, in what way is it a continuation? What have they been doing? What has that new unit done in the 4 months since they've been put into place, in the 3 months since they've been put into place? What are they, and how is the response to them? How has the public responded to the creation of this new unit in the months that have followed the creation of that new unit, Nanra?
So the new unit has it doesn't actually really exist. We've not seen really evidence of this being set up. It was kind of set up in the heat of the protest. It's set up in name, but there's no actual evidence that there's this new force has been put in place. And actually, there's actually a lot of people that have been arrested over the following months, and even were arrested last week, say that SARS actually still exists. And the SARS is still arresting people, and there have been various reports from the ground that say SARS, the units are there, the stations that they occupy. Some protesters were arrested on New Year's Eve by SARS, and they were detained in Abuja in the same SARS locations and beaten and brutalized by SARS. Although the government is saying that this unit is no longer existing, we actually believe that they are still there. And even if they bear another name, it's still the same individuals that are occupying these positions, even though the government said that those people have been reassigned to different tasks. But they never said that the SARS officers were fired or removed from the force, but they only said that they were being moved to a different tactical force.
Okay, very, very interesting. We've got to go into a break right now. We're joined, for those listening, by Nanre Nafziger. She is a Pan-Africanist, activist, and scholar who fights on a variety of fronts for the human rights of Black people and towards the Pan-African Revolution. We'll be back with her in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. Joining us is Nanre Nafziger, a Pan-Africanist, activist, and scholar. She fights for a variety of fronts, or on a variety of fronts, for human rights for Black people and towards the Pan-African Revolution. Nanre, it's in looking into the story, it seems that there are an ungodly number of extrajudicial killings associated with this group SARS, or for that matter, it seems like some of the other police organizations that are in Nigeria. In comparison to the United States for a moment, I think we had between 2013 and 2019 about 13 or let's say 1,000 killings a year, with 99% of the officers basically walking. Now, I question whether or not some of the mayors, some of the governors who are perfectly aware of the number of people that are being killed, shot, or for that matter, the laws being flagrantly undermined, if they themselves are concerned for their safety, and if that in and of itself puts a chill on their ability to do the job of corralling these forces. I'm wondering if something like that is similar in Nigeria or happening in Nigeria. It's part of the reason that, let's say, the governmental mechanisms don't corral the elements of the police force is because they themselves are basically just human beings, and they are also concerned for their own safety, either from the population itself or from those cops who they know kill, rape, and rob on a daily basis. Meaning it's part of the issue here that the government itself and the people in the government are concerned for their own safety against the police force.
Well, I mean, the government has to be concerned for their own safety because they've created a situation. There's no country that experiences inequality and such vast inequality and such deep poverty where there will not be violence. And the violence is produced in so many ways by so many of the policies and the ways in which the government is run. So, of course, there's widespread conflict in Nigeria. You know, we spoke last time about Boko Haram. There's kidnapping. It's dangerous living in Nigeria. It is absolutely dangerous. But the issue is that what is going to solve the problem? Okay, so in Nigeria, for instance, every man basically has to set up their own forces, their own security. So the police is not protecting anyone except maybe the ultra-rich who can actually pay policemen to stand for them. So if I have money and someone offends me, I can actually go and pay the policemen and they will come and arrest that person. So the police are being used by the politicians and by the elite to actually protect themselves. And the question of if there is fear in the country, of course there's fear. It is unsafe to go from city to city, to drive on the street, to live in your house. Nigerians who have any kind of income build walls, 20 feet walls. They have security dogs that can kill people upon entry. It's a police state and it's an insecure state. So there is a lot of chaos. But the police and the army and the military and every force that is under the power of this government is not contributing to creating peace. It's not protecting people. It's not changing the status. You have people that are arrested. The SARS protesters that you're hearing from, and many of these young people, they got out. They're still alive to tell their stories. But so many Nigerians are locked. The jails are congested with thousands and thousands of men and women who have never even stood trial because they have been arrested and thrown into jail and they don't have money to make bail, much like we see here. And sometimes no one even knows they were there. As a young person at the age of 16, my high school friend was arrested for sitting in his car on the street, smoking a cigarette. And he was arrested and detained. We could not find him for 5 days. And he was detained illegally in a police cell and tortured. And this was over 20 years ago. And this continues to be the case, is that the chaos that is ruling Nigeria, the way that things are, it is unsustainable. And the End SARS movement, that's why I said in the beginning that it comes out of a much longer history where people are fed up. And they're not just fed up with SARS. If you see, as the protest continued, a lot of new hashtags came up, and bad governance, and police brutality, and brutality in Nigeria. So many different hashtags came up. Revolution Now was also another hashtag that came up, and a Revolution Now movement, meaning that young people are saying enough is enough. We cannot continue to live in this society. We don't have the means to. We're not able to survive this. And in that situation, there cannot be security for anyone. Even if you have money, you will not be protected. So there needs to be a much wider change in the country for anyone to be safe.
Why did Nigeria get to this situation? If you could go back and look at the sort of underlying problems that led to this, why has this happened, Anra?
Well, like many African states, these are creations of a colonial project. There's so many reasons why Nigeria and other African countries are underdeveloped. Of course, these states were put together with different ethnic groups. That has been seen as one of the villains. There's been a lot of ethnic conflict. So the ethnic groups that comprise Nigeria were not necessarily meant to be together. And many times our civil war was actually one of the ethnic groups, the Igbo ethnic group that tried to break away. Different ethnic groups have tried to break away. So there are those ethnic tensions. There's religious tensions. But there's also economic tensions. Nigeria is I would say, an underdeveloped economy, and it's an underdeveloped state. And that is not just a function of what is happening in the country. It's also what have been the policies of international factors, the World Bank, the U.S. government, the governments in the EU. Why is Africa unstable? It's a question that we could talk about all day. African countries are systematically underdeveloped, and they are actually feeding into an international economic system that places priority on money going out of the country and not actually being used internally. So Nigeria had various military dictatorships, and I would say the current economic situation is after 1988. In the 1980s, the 1990s, there were policies by the World Bank and the IMF which drained the Nigerian economy, which stopped social programs, education programs, which took money away from universities, which devalued the currency. And since then, Nigeria has been on a continuous economic spiral, where only the rich and the elite benefit from the oil economy, and actually continue to the governors and the elite class continue to take all the resources of the country, while the rest of the people have virtually nothing in their hands.
That's kind of where I was going to go with this. is the problems that Nigeria are facing, are they mainly economic? And if so, how does Nigeria pull itself out of this kind of morass? I mean, what's, from your standpoint, I guess, what is a solution? What is, at the very least, a plan to move in a direction that will be that much more sustainable and that much more better to bring down hostilities? Because I agree with you. If you have a dirt poor country, then you have problems associated with how do people get paid? Are you going to have issues with safety? Are you going to have issues with people going beyond the law in order to make extra money for their families? I mean, all sorts of problems come into being. So how does Nigeria pull itself out of this condition? And is it possible for Nigeria to pull itself out of this particular condition?
For sure. Nigeria has enormous economic potential. And you can see Nigerians there's been a massive brain drain, and you can see Nigerians across the world doing such amazing things in every sector of other economies other than their own. There are a few things that have to happen in Nigeria. And one is basically, the most important thing is that Nigerians need to be able to dissent. They need to be able to express themselves and have their fundamental human rights being protected. So I want to make sure that I say before this interview is over that since October, protests have been completely quelled. Nigerians are not allowed on the streets. They're not. They're being arrested. They're being detained. They're even being murdered for these protests. So basically, no one is allowed to protest in Nigeria right now. And even there have been laws that have been passed that say protests cannot hold, often under the guise of COVID and other things. But so when Nigerians are able to rise up and demand better governance, those rights need to be protected. Because right now is a very critical moment, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa, when citizens are rising up and saying enough is enough, and they are being violently suppressed. So Nigeria can change if citizens are able to come and say, we don't want this, and this is what we want. So that's the most important thing, is the protection of human rights. Because now Nigerians are rising up. Citizens are rising up and saying, we want better governance. We want to have governors that care about education. Nigerian school systems have been shuttered. People spend so long trying to achieve a degree. So the protection of citizens' rights to protest is very important. And secondly, all of the social sectors that need to be developed are so critical. Education is key. Public education has been on a downslide, as I said, since the 1980s, where people graduate from school and are barely literate. And so having a population, keeping this population without education also is a way to disempower citizens from being able to express their fundamental rights. So I think those are some of the first few steps, is empowering civil society, ensuring access to quality public education, and then Nigerian citizens will be able to fix the country themselves. They'll be able to form a country that they want, that they desire. And so taking off kind of the hand of the oppressor is very important. And as an international community, we need to pay attention to what's happening in Nigeria. It's not just happening in Nigeria. The Ugandan election is coming up. And we see the same kind of things happening, is that when there is a cry for change, when populations are tired and when they push back, if they are violently oppressed, we don't give any room for that change to take place. I believe that in every nation, citizens are able to demand what they want, but they need to be able to have that room to create the kind of country that they want. And that's what we need in Nigeria, and that's what we need across the African continent.
And like you're saying, the people's ability to protest is effectively curtailed right now due to the pandemic largely, but also, of course, I'm guessing, due to the response to these protests. Taking that into account, an effective resistance to the current government is not going to take form in the streets, very likely throughout this year. But two sort of paired questions here. One, how active is the online conversation about this right now in Nigeria? And two, are there any sort of promising groups or promising coalitions that you see in the making that in a year or two might have the capacity or the power to be able to push effectively back against the Nigerian government? What do you see in that respect, Nanra?
Well, I think there's also a lot of suppression on online activism. So a lot of groups have gone underground. And I probably wouldn't want to name the groups actually that I think are most promising, because they're actually being targeted by the government. So even WhatsApp groups, people are very afraid. I've seen a lot of Nigerians get on Signal, Telegram. There's a lot of escape of Facebook and other channels, but the Nigerian government is monitoring. And I think that there are several movements. Nigeria is very huge and very diverse that are emerging out of this, but they are emerging in a way in which they don't want the limelight placed on them so that they can effectively organize. And over the next few years, our next general election is coming up in 2023. And a lot of people have said, okay, if we're not allowed on the streets, I was actually in a group last week that said, can we go back to the streets? We have these demands. And people responded, no, going back to the streets would be suicide at this point. It's suicidal. We can't go back to the streets. So I think everyone at this stage right now is organizing, mobilizing in their own ways, kind of in very quiet ways. And I believe that you will see a comeback this year or next year of this movement. It's not dead.
Nanra, we're out of time, but we're out of time now. But we have to get you back on to talk about that a little bit closer to those dates, if not sooner. For those listening, that was Nanra Nafziger, Pan-Africanist activist and scholar. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering American politics and news and more from across the divided states and across the fragmented surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Dane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, getting into the headlines. In the news this morning, first up in COVID news, at least 4,402 new coronavirus deaths and 229,603 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday, January 12th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 249,945 cases per day. Let's just call that 250,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 37% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Wednesday morning, more than 22,903,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 380,000 have died. Just a quick note, this is another new high. I think we mentioned this earlier on during previous headline segments, but just to add this in, this is a new high in deaths. We're back to the point that we were earlier in 2020, in June, that period, where we're getting regular daily new death total highs, which is not good. It's sensible. A lot of people were predicting this in the sense that we're, still in the cold and flu season. This is after the holidays hit and travel picked up, and so a lot of people were circulating and therefore likely circulating the virus. But I'm just, again, pointing this out. As Jamarl said earlier on, we expect to see 5,000 deaths per day. Sadly, within, at the latest, I would say the next 2 months. I would put it a bit earlier, probably less than a month from now. And in my opinion, could be as soon as the next week or so that we start to see death totals hitting that high. So not a good state of affairs. And then, of course, there's also as a new strain of COVID originating apparently in the United Kingdom that is more infectious has been circulating, identified at last count in 10 states in the U.S. so far. That's, admittedly not that many states. But if this thing is more infectious than the current variant, if it's dramatically more infectious, as it seems to be, 30 to 70%, that's the range that I've seen, then, that new strain will quickly start to spread. And the rate at which it outspreads the other strain, while at first it won't be higher than the rate at which the current strain is spreading, eventually those lines will cross. And we'll see a very dramatic inflection point. That's my prediction, but we'll see how that goes. There could be more mutations. There could be, significant vaccination events or other sort of unforeseen events that happen. But that's my prediction. We'll see how that comes to pass. Former Bolivian President Evo Morales has tested positive for COVID-19. There is now a third Democratic lawmaker that has tested positive following the Capitol riot last week. As reported yesterday, House Democrats Bonnie Watson Coleman and Pramila Jayapal tested positive, and now Illinois Congressman Brad Schneider has joined their ranks, announcing his diagnosis. During the riots, lawmakers took shelter in a secure room with staff, and as a result, the congressional doctor advised everyone to get tested. You know, if you're in a tight space like that, those are the conditions in which COVID spreads, and it appears that it has spread. Warp Speed officials said in a Tuesday press briefing that they will now increase the number of doses available to states and jurisdictions, ditching the current strategy of holding back half of the available doses to reserve them for the second round of the two-dose immunizations. The upside of this, of course, is that you can start the process of getting more people vaccinated. The downside is that some people who were guaranteed their second dose may now not get it if logistically the doses aren't rolled out on time to those population centers that need them. You know, the coverage of this at the very least, I'm not an expert on how the vaccine logistics are being handled, but from what I've heard, it's kind of been bungled, particularly if you compare it to President Trump, the White House administration, and Warp Speed's guarantees, effectively, their promises about when it would be happening late last year, early this one. So things are slower than they were predicting, but and therefore they might not be able to do the follow-up like they said they were going to do. But we'll see. Jamarl, I know you've been following this stuff too, of course. What's your take on the vaccine rollout? I don't think we've talked about that side, but we've talked about the merits or benefits of getting the vaccine out sooner, the mRNA vaccine, which is, of course, what we're using at this point. But what do you think about the rollout process of those vaccines?
It's funny. From my understanding, some of the rollout was somewhat bungled on this stuff, where some of the vaccines were in danger of going lost. And so it's kind of like the people who bungled dealing with the virus were the people who are responsible for putting the rollout. By the same token, the release of the other vials of the vaccine, I suppose, they're trying to go kind of all hands on deck. Joe Biden is apparently, again, all hands on deck, basically getting as many out as he possibly can. And the money that are going to the states are going to go with this notion of getting as many out as they possibly can. So I suspect that in trying to, let's say, outdo Trump and to try to set a strong departure from what was in the Trump administration, I would imagine Biden will probably take it to the nth degree in trying to get this stuff out. I think they will probably push extremely hard to get this idea of people to take it, because I still think some people are hesitant about the vaccine in and of itself. You know what I mean? But I got to be honest, 4,400 deaths is kind of a push, if nothing else is a push, especially with the idea of trying to get back to some sense of normality in the face of all of this. It's just the numbers are so astonishing. Like, can you imagine? I remember we were at 2,000 deaths, and we're like, wow, this number is so high. We're at 4,400 deaths a day. That number is astonishing. So no, I think they're going to push extremely hard for the vaccinations. I mean, at this point, this is the thing that they're looking at for the sense of normality. One last point. The mRNA vaccine is new technology. Now, just because it's new technology doesn't make it bad. And I suspect that what is going to take place is people are going to be monitoring the population after they're inoculated with this stuff to make sure that there are no long-term consequences from it. But it is a potentially potent new technology. Like I said before, they seem to think that it may cure multiple sclerosis. At the very least, it did so in rats. And there's like a list of other illnesses that the mRNA and mRNA technology is considering to be used for. I mean, basically, you're putting something in the body that's a messenger. And the messenger says, go build this protein. And it builds the protein in your body at that point, recognizes it as such, and behaves accordingly. Now, imagine having the ability to tell the body to do various things in order to deal with certain medical conditions. That is phenomenal technology. So I am not going to be the one that take issue with science advancing in a way that I think is phenomenal. So I think it goes better. I mean, I do think it gets worse in the short term in February and March, but I do think at some point there has to be an inflection point where, depending upon the vaccines, depending upon this kind of, I guess, immunity within the context of the population, where the virus starts to trend downward, and that's assuming that it doesn't get more lethal. So that's the rollout, from my understanding, has been not horrible, but not great either. And I guess that's going to get better when Biden comes in. I think it has to, just based on the politics of it.
And I just also, so a couple of things to point out really quickly here. One is, I want to come back to the new strain. If you remember correctly, one of the major sort of problems with how the Spanish flu event went was in the first year, it started circulating, it was deadly. In the second year, a new mutant strain showed up that was way more deadly, particularly because it started to hit young people harder than it had been the previous year. In this case, we have a weirdly paralleled set of events where the new strain that's come out in this second year, again, it was late last year, but effectively it's going to be starting to circulate and I would argue predominate mid to early 2021. The new strain is not technically more deadly. It seems to be about as deadly as the old one, but it is more infectious, which makes it more deadly. It means that it's going to spread faster. It's going to be harder to contain it. Some of the measures that you would have used to contain it are going to be less effective. So probably just my guess is from reading about it a bit and from seeing what other people's estimations are, wearing a mask, while still effective, will be just less effective because it's more infectious, because there's a higher chance of those masks preventing its spread effectively. So a weird parallel there. Again, it's not technically more deadly, but because it's more infectious, the impact is going to be more severe. And then back to the vaccine rollout, just to follow up and try to cap this off briefly. We chose the worst possible time in the US to start rolling out this vaccine. If you remember, I think it was December 14th that the first vaccine was administered as a part of our rollout. And then right after that, 10 days after that, you hit Christmas. And through this entire period during a holiday season, over Christmas, many medical workers who would have been administering these vaccines took days off, and many people who might have gone in to receive them if they'd been able to get to them in the first place were, either at home celebrating or just doing their thing. Mostly, though, I think you should focus on the ability of the medical establishment to roll this stuff out. The holiday season, in a couple of different ways, was the worst time to get this stuff going. So as I've sort of consistently said, I think we should have gotten this going way earlier. If we'd hit it in October or November, like you're saying, the mRNA vaccine is unproven technology, but it seems to have been working pretty well in the trials that they did on it. If we'd gotten it going sooner, we could have hit where we needed to hit before the sort of holiday slump in our ability to administer it, and that might have made a crucial difference, particularly as this new strain has started to spread. You know what? We got to move into other headlines. More we could talk about here. I kind of wanted to hear where you think we're going to be with the virus in a year, if in 2022, the beginning of 2022, we will have beat it.
Yeah, that's kind of far.
That's a hard
it's
one.
hard to predict on that one. Let me say one thing though. The Spanish flu, it also had to do with the military. If you remember, this was after the First World War. You had troops all over the world, and you had basically a breeding ground where people went back to their home countries and basically spread it all over the world. So it's a slight difference in regards to how. Well, maybe not. I mean, when you think about airlines and the integrated world we have from a global community, maybe not. I mean, this spread in no time from China. And under normal circumstances, if you were talking about, let's say, in the 1900s, would you have the capacity to spread it that fast without, let's say, a war? Probably not. So it is somewhat of an odd parallel, isn't it? I mean, a global integrated system could be a parallel for the U.S. military or for the military across the world going to the different places spreading it. Yeah, maybe that is a parallel. Maybe you're right.
All right, going into national political news now. Yesterday, the U.S. House of Representatives approved a resolution with a 223 to 205 vote to call on VP Pence and the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment to the Constitution to declare President Trump as unable to serve. Pence, who was among those forced to take shelter inside the Capitol complex during last week's attack, said that before the vote, he would take no such action. Said, before the vote, that he would take no such action. Leaving lawmakers with impeachment as their only option to remove Trump from office before January 20th, when President-elect Joe Biden is set to be sworn in as president. Trump faces a single charge of, quote, incitement of insurrection, end quote. After months of uncertainty, New York City's Department of Education announced yesterday that the city's Accelerated Gifted and Talented program, a single test entry system into academically advanced opportunities, will end after this year. The standardized test begins at age 4, and those who oppose the program say that the admissions model favors families of means who are better able to prepare for the test, and that the exam serves as a poor marker of talent in young children. Critics argue that the programs are not reflective of the city's larger racial portrait and need to be remade. Asian students account for 43% of gifted and talented students, followed by whites at 36%, Hispanics at 8%, and African Americans at 6%. The DOE spokesperson said that, quote, this will be the last year New York City administers this kindergarten test. For our youngest learners, we must move forward and develop a system that reimagines accelerated learning and enrichment. At the same time, we want to honor the fact that families have been planning kindergarten admissions for many months now, end quote. In international news, Estonian Prime Minister Jüri Ratas announced on Wednesday he was resigning in the wake of a corruption scandal around Tallinn's real estate development. Earlier this week, Estonia's public prosecutor's office said it suspected the Centre Party, which Ratas chairs, and 5 individuals of being involved in a corruption case. The party allegedly received financial support in return for approving a €39 million euro loan. That's $47.6 million. That Estonia's state credit agency Credex provided to the Porto Franco Real Estate Development Company. The outgoing prime minister stressed that despite taking political responsibility for the loan scandal, he was not fully informed about all the details. In Kuwait, Prime Minister Sabah Khaled Al-Hamad Al-Sabah on Wednesday submitted his resignation to the country's ruler, Nawaf Al-Ahmad Al-Jabbar Al-Sabah. On Tuesday, members of the Kuwaiti government tendered their resignation en masse in light of differences with the parliament. The move came days after 30 lawmakers submitted a motion to question the premier over a number of issues, including the composition of his cabinet. According to Kuwait's government communications office, the move was made, quote, in light of developments in the relationship between the National Assembly and the government. However, end quote, however, the office did not comment on the details of the resignation. The decision comes just a month after the cabinet was formed. So Kuwait's government in a state of crisis there. In New Zealand, a man smashed the glass front doors of the country's parliament building with an axe early on Wednesday morning. The 31-year-old man appeared at the Wellington District Court Wednesday morning for intentional damage and possession of an offensive weapon, the spokesperson said. The motive for the attack is unclear, and police declined to comment further, citing an ongoing court case. Threats to New Zealand's parliament are relatively rare, and there is minimal security around the legislature. The grounds are open to the public. Office workers frequently have lunch on the grass in front of the building, and children play in the nearby playground. And in our last headline this morning, didn't get to this earlier, this is big news in its own way. YouTube has suspended President Donald Trump's channel from uploading new videos to the platform for at least a week over concerns about the quote-unquote ongoing potential for violence. The company announced in a tweet late on Tuesday evening, saying that it, quote, now has its first strike and is temporarily prevented from uploading new content for a minimum of 7 days, end quote. This, of course, comes after this weekend, last Friday, Twitter permanently banned Donald Trump. And on Sunday, I'll start with Saturday, actually, Google and Apple removed the social media communications app and perceived alternative to Twitter, Parler, from their app stores. And then on Sunday, Amazon, with its AWS, which Parler had been using basically a sort of server provision service, they removed Parler too. So Parler is offline as of this moment. And we'll be talking about this and more in just a minute with Mark Frost. But first, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're going to go into our break. We'll be back again, continuing that conversation on tech censorship and a lot more, I'm sure, with Mark Frost. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Mark Frost, an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian, who you can follow on Twitter, by the way, at Frosty Cash. And that is Frosty with a T-I-E at the end, not a T-Y, just for those diligent enough to type that into their browser directly and find his Twitter page, which you should. Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you folks?
I'm all right. Thank you for being with us. Let's talk about last week's events and the various consequences of last week's events. Last Wednesday, of course, the Capitol building was raided by a mob of pro-Trump insurrectionaries. I don't know what else to call them at this point. Let's just start there. What do you think about what happened last week, Mark?
I think some people took what Trump had to say and they took it a little too close to heart, and they did an act of insurrection. And it split, whatever you want to call it, the Trump movement, Trump mania, whatever it was. But the thrust of Trump fell by about half, because about half his supporters, best I can tell, dumped him. So people like me that primarily voted against Biden-Harris dumped him. I dumped him before the riots even started. What really got to me was when he was telling Pence right before the riots that Pence should try to overturn the election, when Pence has zero, nada, zilch constitutional authority to do so. The 25th Amendment was nothing about that. Pence had no authority to decertify a state legislature's slate of electors. And the big problem for Trump people that considered voting for Trump and decided to do so even despite the warnings. The big warning was always narcissism. Anybody that's known a narcissist in their life knows what happens when they lose, whether it's a game of Monopoly or a game of life. And he could have left office graciously. He could have come back to fight in 2024 or even 2022, but his narcissism got the best of him, and he said things he shouldn't have said. The core of his core took him very seriously, and what we have is an act of literal insurrection in the modern age. And I'm not talking about burning businesses or assaulting a courthouse. I'm talking about at the request, at least the implied request of a president of the United States, his supporters went and ransacked Congress while they were doing congressional constitutional business. There's just no place for that in a country like the United States. I reject it, I condemn it, and I did it from the very second it started happening.
Yeah, it was an attack on American sovereignty by basically the president of the United States that didn't want to accept the fact that he lost the race. It's shocking to watch, actually. I mean, basically a mob of people pushed by president and various Republicans. There's nothing wrong with contesting election results. I was all in for Trump saying, all right, I'm going to, I won this and I want to make sure I won it, and going through courthouses and stuff like that to try to say, all right, this is our evidence. Great, do that. I don't even see anything wrong with protests. Great, do that. But an insurrection where people riled up by the president ransacked the Capitol building and attacked the Capitol with pipe bombs. People had zip ties like they were going to take hostages. I mean, this was extreme stuff. And just because Donald Trump was doing it in the open doesn't make it any less drastic or radical in regards to what he was trying to do. He was trying to overthrow America. It
actually makes it more.
Yeah.
Yeah. More.
Well, right. It makes it worse.
More crazy.
Let me ask you, the people who are willing to go along with this, like the thing that scares me more than anything else is that this seemed dodgy, and yet you still had all sorts of members who were willing to go along with it. And it gets this thing of, okay, what comes next? When somebody else who has a little bit more institutional support and who has people, let's say, if they had Mike Pence on their side, that might have even went that route, despite the fact that they don't have any powers to do it. I mean, none of this stuff is real. All of these things are just items of conception. And so you only need the argument to be made for that to get into very bad places. Does this give you any fear for future administrations where the same idea of people being willing to basically go along with somebody, even though they know that the person is not necessarily being honest, but doing it for issues of power?
Yeah, I think it always gives me trepidation when anything like that can happen. As many people have talked about, there is a fragility to any democratic process, whether it's a republic like ours, a parliamentary system, and a lot of what works that in a democratic republic is things work by faith. People wake up in the morning and they generally believe, yeah, there's going to be maybe a little voter fraud. There's going to be a little corruption here and there, but they generally believe that the system works and that the system works for them. And so I think I actually feel better about it. I think what has made me happy, if such a thing can, if I can use a phrase like that, is it wasn't what I thought probably was going to happen. As soon as he started talking about Pence decertifying that kind of stuff, I figured Republicans would come to his defense and Democrats would go against him, and we would have just kind of what we've always had. But most Republicans, there's a couple exceptions, but most Republicans have denounced not just the riots, but they've denounced Trump's role in it pretty strongly, and that gives me a lot of hope. The military, this morning I just read, all 8 Joint Chiefs of Staff signed off on it, basically condemning the riots, letting everybody know, and they reconsolidated some command and control. So the system is working in the sense that I think it's keeping, dictators at bay. And that's a hard pill for people that voted for Trump. I made a calculus that voting for Trump was less wrong than voting for Biden-Harris, but I have to say I was wrong because Trump didn't want to leave. That was the number one thing that his critics have said all along. He's a narcissist, he won't leave. He's a narcissist, he won't leave. And yet, here we find ourselves, he's a narcissist and he didn't want to leave. And he at least seems to have promoted a very bad form of insurrection. I would respect it more if it was a coup. It doesn't even qualify as a coup. It's a bunch of idiots that got together and decided, it'd be a good day to storm the Congress while they're in constitutional session. And the stupidity of it, I guess, is what gets to me. I mean, I would think a 10th grader could plan a better insurrection than that.
Yeah, it's as if they thought that just simply occupying the building would amount to a revolution when it just made them look like fools. You were talking about how half of the Republican base for Trump, half of Trump's base, has effectively abandoned him, in part, I would say, because the day after the events, and this is, again, a small part, he abandoned them. He not only called he not only incited the insurrection effectively. Of course, that's what's at issue. Yeah. Yes, but then the day after he had called many of the folks in the crowd. He'd said he loved them. He called them very special people. He called them criminals, like exactly like you're saying. So that's a crazy turnabout there. But here's where I'm going with this. With so much of the Republican base effectively disempowered from voting, not just for Trump, but I would say for a Trump-like future Republican candidate, and with the Republican Party as a whole having pivoted necessarily to a Trump-like candidate, to its messaging in terms of its rhetoric, I don't see Republicans doing 2020 well in 2024 or 2022, and we'll see about 2026 and 2028, but I think this stain is a little bit deeper. Where does that leave the American political system? Because while I agree with you and you're right that this shows that America is not yet ready to put it in a despot, we have something like a despotic regime. And I think that this didn't give Biden a mandate, but it gave Biden a pass. Last Wednesday's events have meant that a lot of people are going to overlook some of Biden's transgressions in his first term. So it seems like we have cemented the uniparty rule with Trump as, an alternative to that briefly. Where do you think that leaves American politics in general on the other side of this event with Trump sort of out of the picture? Mark?
Well, right now it leaves the Republican Party in disarray because there was one thing that kept the crazy Republicans together, and that was Donald Trump's personality. Well, now the Democrats have the have the problem that the Republicans have had, right? Now the Democrats have to go govern not just the country; they have to govern themselves. And let's be honest, every Democrat is not the same. There's wide differences just among Democrats, just like there are with Republicans. I mean, there's the anarcho-capitalist wing of the Republican Party that would like to have anarchy. They would like to see government go down the tube. So, I mean, every party has its variances. But I think 4 years is an eternity in election time. A lot can happen in just 2 years. And what that has to do with was the general fears and that sort of a thing that pops up when new presidents take charge. I'm an anti-hawk, if that makes any sense. I don't like war for the sake of war or war just because it's easier politically, which means most of the wars this country's been in. I don't really like those wars. And so my suspicion is that there's going to be something pop up somewhere in the world where the Clinton-style diplomacy is seen to be needed, and we're going to be in another war here sometime. And I think that's probably going to split the Democratic Party itself, because the Democratic Party is a weird collection of progressives, libertarians, traditional liberals, post-Marxists. And it's a strange collection of people who don't necessarily see eye to eye. Certainly, I have a lot more in common with progressives than I do typical traditional Democrats. That's for sure. I don't see eye to eye on everything, but I can usually have a lunch or a breakfast and have a good time chatting with a progressive, even if we disagree on something. If it's a traditional Hillary Clinton style Democrat, less so.
You know what? We need to go into a break. Agreed on that account, on that account, though, Mark. We're joined by Mark Frost. He's an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian. And we'll be back with him in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back on the other side of this break.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from our station in D.C. Joining us is Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian. Mark, again, welcome back to the show, man. I always enjoy it when you're here.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, so there's an argument I want to get into, but maybe this is probably the wrong time to do it. So let's talk about the big tech one. I want to get into this notion of the capitalistic system and it turning into socialism. I have great qualms about that because I don't buy it. I think people will do whatever they have to do to maintain a certain distance from a distance in power, meaning that before it turns into socialism and it turns into something where the power advantage will kind of level off, that they will basically take actions to not allow it. I mean, think about what we've seen for this, for example, the crash, where you have all of these people lose their jobs and the stock market goes through the roof. And it wasn't a situation where, hey, let's share that. Hey, let's expand that out. It was basically, no, we're not going to give some of that money to the public. We are not going to act like some of the European countries that gave like $1,600 or how much ever to, like you said, dumping money out of the helicopters. We did the opposite of that. And I get the feeling that if there was a situation where wealth and those type of things expanded, it would do just like it's doing now, where it accrues to, let's say, an upper 0.1%, where everyone else struggles. And then the propaganda of the system itself says that this is just and this is fine. I don't buy the turning into socialism. I buy the notion of a hellscape where where machines are doing all of the work and people are basically getting basic of UBIs while the other people live different lives. Okay, fair enough. I'm going to drag this show into that. What do you think about that? Do you buy the idea of Schupner in the way that you've described it, where this capitalistic system gives back so much that it becomes this kind of abundance of a socialistic system?
Yeah, because it's important. I make a stronger separation between socialism and fascism than maybe some economic historians do. But Schumpeter argued basically that capitalism would destroy itself because the people that drive capitalism, the entrepreneurs, are actually behave as Marxists. They love socialism, or excuse me, they love capitalism when it's profits, when it's privatized profits. Capitalism's awesome. But when now it's privatized losses and there's not enough private capital convenient to bail it out, now everybody becomes a socialist. So that's what he meant when he said the true pacemakers of socialism were not the Marxists and social agitators who preached it, but the Mellons, Carnegies, and Rockefellers. If he was alive today, it probably would have been the Gates, the Buffetts, and the Amazons, those big corporate type titans that we have in there.
Speaking of the titans for the moment.
We also have another...
Oh, go ahead.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Well, I was going to say, speaking of the titans,
fine.
taking that into this notion of censorship, where these guys basically shut up the president of the United States, got rid of Parler, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's a scary reality where basically a small cadre of people can basically control speech in such a way. But please continue. Please finish.
It is a scary reality, and it's also scary for the libertarian movement, because this is one of those dogmas that we have that we would probably just about every libertarian would say that, in that censorship, to be censorship requires police power. So it would require a government response to be censored. If Twitter says, Frost, I don't like your commentary on Twitter, you're banned, the traditional libertarian response is, well, that's not censorship. That's a private transaction between two parties. One person does not want to do business with the other person. That, I'm sure, covers 99.9% of most libertarians, and most libertarians would be down with that. Well, when TV was developed, the Supreme Court said, well, okay, it's about the scarcity of airwaves. We can regulate broadcast TV because there's only 3 channels. There's a scarcity of airways, and we have to make sure that we don't have a monopoly in the news business. And so they kind of made the deal that they have. And then we have cable TV and all the indie TVs and streaming and this and that. And it begs the question, and I don't know that I have the answer. I have an opinion, but I don't think I have the answer, because the opposite of my answer has good arguments for it and against it as well. Has tech become so complex and so public goodish that it's become a utility? The courts have said that any utility company can be regulated because they're usually monopolies within that city. They have natural monopolies associated with them. That is, their average total cost curve is decreasing at the point of production. That means they can continue to produce more electricity for less per kilowatt than, say, a brand new company coming in. And so that's always been the argument around what I call a pseudo-fascist organization by government. So fascism is when government and private business get to bed for the welfare of the collective. you still have private property, you still have a stock market, or you can have one, but the purpose is no longer stockholder profits or individual rationality. The purpose is the welfare of the state, the collective, the society as a whole. As Mussolini called it, it's the third way. It's neither capitalism nor is it communism. It's part socialism, part capitalism, with a big helping of government on top, because government is what forces business to do the right thing. And if it's democratic government, then that government is responsible to the democracy, and that's good fascism as opposed to bad fascism. And my big worry, I think I have a bigger worry, going back to your earlier question, that we're going to have a dictatorship through oligarchy than I am that we're going to have a dictatorship through a king, like a Trump. I think that if the United States ever becomes an undemocratic country, if it ever goes over that line, I think it will be because it did so in favor of oligarchy, not an emperor.
So, Mark, I want to come back to the sort of initial question that Jamarl asked that led us into this conversation, sure. And I want to come at it from another line of approach. You're talking about kings here. In the modern era, you can see this, of course, in the long-term contest between socialism and capitalism, or Marxism and capitalism more recently. You have these sort of two separate spheres of power. And like you're saying, it seems like governance and private industry are coming closer and closer together. And you're getting this union. Now, I want to come back to an earlier contest that was going on. I would argue that this was the contest that preceded the Industrial Revolution, although it had its death throes in the Enlightenment, which of course was more or less coincidental, coincided with the Industrial Revolution, which was this idea of like a divine right, where you had the papacy, you had some sort of perceived independent spiritual realm, which was perceived to limit the power of the kings in Europe. And what happened, over time, what happened was divine right was conceived as this thing that could be taken away from kings. And then as a power, it was assumed by kings in the era of absolutism in the 1600s and early 1700s. And basically, as that supposed contest, which became fused into a single entity, was dying, you had the birth of this new dilemma or new contradiction between, capital power and the mandate of the state. And now it seems like those two are fusing, like you're talking about. I'm curious, from this conversation about capitalism versus socialism, if they're fusing together, if we are living in an era where those two ostensibly contesting enemies of each other have effectively been conjoined at the hip, it seems to me like we need, or are inevitably entering into, some new definition, some new era of contest between two perceived powers. Either that, or we're simply going into this new monolithic sort of entity that we're all becoming a part of. I know this is a little bit abstract, but I'm curious, Mark, looking at this, do you have any idea, what that might be? If you grant the premises, if you think there's anything to the point that I'm making, do you have any idea what that new contest would be, or do you think that's too simple? Do you see it in other terms? Mark, what's your take?
No, I actually like where you're heading, and I call it what it should be called. It's just not popular today because of World War II. But what it ought to be called is what it is. It's fascism. It might be nice fascism. It might have a little smiley face as the logo, but it's still fascism. It's that third way. It's saying, okay, we have private property, but we have it not for the welfare of the individual. We have it for the welfare of the collective. It just so happens that a private property owner will develop and nurture that land as one of the factors of production better than government will. So we'll let him loose with that, and we'll give him a percentage of the return that he's able to do on that, because we recognize people are self-interested and they need motivations and that sort of a thing. But we don't need, Britney Spears will still be Britney Spears and do all the things that it requires to be Britney Spears at 1/10 of her income. Yeah, she's a superhuman performer. She's going to make more than the average Joe, but she doesn't need to make 200 times the average income of, the total income of Children's Hospital that does all this pro bono work. So nice fascism, that is, take the horrors of World War II out of it, and that's where we're heading. It's not putting Jews in cyanide showers. It might be a different kind of enemy, and it might be a different kind of shower, because there's no fascism that one can even envision on the nice side that is going to be as individually free as a laissez-faire capitalist system, which is really the theory of the individual. And it probably started for a variety of reasons, but certainly nuclear weapons has kind of shut down the Second Amendment debate, in that if the federal government has it, then an ordinary citizen can have it, keep and bear arms. Most people have fallen out of that because they recognize, do I want private citizen Bill Gates to have his own nuclear weapons? And most people say no. That sort of a thing. And so what we have is a population where most of the population, forget Democrat or Republican, progressive, any of that, but most of the population today wants government to do something for them. They want government to use its police power and make their lives better. Well, that's fascism. If you're going to retain a capitalist shell and you're going to have private property, you're going to have stock markets, that sort of a thing, that's fascism. And if Jeff Bezos gets out of hand, then government slaps him down a little bit, just like China has done with Jack Ma. Nobody knows where he is. But that's fascism. It's when the government is the police, basically, on corporate strategy. The idea is you don't want corporate strategy, as good as it might be for a set of shareholders, to do something that's bad for the environment, or bad for national security, or bad for the people in general. That sort of a thing. And it seems to me, if you step back from the offensiveness of the word from history and you look at where is society actually heading, we're not moving to communism and socialism. We're not moving to laissez-faire capitalism. We're moving to the third way. We're clearly moving to a fascist economic system by which government and business, in bed with each other, produce contrived solutions that are far away from the unseen hand of Adam Smith.
And far from real solutions. You know what? We got to cut it here. Mark, thank you for joining us. Well, for those listening, that was Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schimpetarian, and recovering libertarian. For taking calls on the other side of this break, you can call in 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. And again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on, man? What's on your mind?
A lot. Dealing with what's going on. Sheldon Adelson, he didn't like Julian Assange. I think he was part of the spy network that was spying on him. If Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer go forward and impeach Trump, then this is my opinion, they'll make him a martyr. He's already becoming a martyr. And also, his support, I read a poll somewhere, his job approval rating was at 49%, and also people still is backing him. Now, I got to finish this. People still backing him. When I was in the military, I served with people from different parts of the United States, different parts of the United States, and Christian value, conservative, didn't believe in abortion. We would start sometimes, we're going to prayer, even though we had people in the unit that wasn't Christian. We're still going to a Christian prayer. So all I'm saying is this, is that we need to unify, we need to work some things out, but if you start passing these gun control laws and domestic terrorism stuff, then that's going to start isolating people more. And you have these conservatives that's upset what happened on January 6th and also November the 3rd. So there's a lot of people that's out there. So Chuck Schumer and that's they got to slow their roll. You know what I'm saying? Because things will get worse and worse. They got talking about Texas and southern states talking about seceding now. So if that happens, then that's less money in the corpus for the federal government to even pay for WIC and staffs and for the military and also Social Security and things like that. All right?
Tarif, I want to keep you on. We are still taking calls, 202-521-1320. Texas specifically has been talking about seceding every couple of years now. Like for as long as I've remembered, and I'm a relatively young dude, but still for as long as I've been alive, every little once in a while, Texas talks about seceding from the government. So that's thing one. That's not a new.
They're also a debtor state, if I'm not mistaken.
What's up?
They're also a debtor state, meaning the government pays more money out to Texas than they take from Texas.
And then when it comes to, Tarif, when it comes to your comments about martyrdom, I think it depends on how harshly Trump is treated once he's out of the Oval Office. But if they go ahead and push for an impeachment, it is so close to the inauguration date for Joe Biden. And in light of what he did, I think that Mark was right when he was saying, I don't know if half is right, but I think a substantial enough portion of Trump's base has been cut off that even among the true believers, even among the diehards who still support Trump and will into perpetuity, I don't think there are enough. And frankly, I don't think they have enough to go on to rally enough of the public to pose a significant threat. What they will pose as, unfortunately, is a boogeyman for the establishment. So, and you're talking about domestic terrorism and various other laws. You brought up the push to take away people's guns. If, as a boogeyman, they will serve as a useful foil, as a useful opponent for Biden's administration to crack down on everybody's freedom. I think we all agree on that 100%. But I do not think that Trump will serve as a useful rallying martyr, because so far, I'll be honest, he has not been crucified. So far, he has not, talking about pushing him out of office this close to the hill, this close to Biden coming in, isn't the same thing as putting him away for life. Or, one point against what I'm saying is with Twitter blocking him, that's gonna get people who like Trump and even a lot of people who don't like Trump, and it already has, to defend him in sort of hushed ways. But I would argue that their ire is being drawn against big tech, and there are a lot of people who hate Trump, who are only stepping up to defend him because they really don't like what big tech is doing. So I do not see his role as a martyr here. Jamarl, you came in for a second. I didn't mean to cut you off. And Tarif, I want to hear your response too.
No, that was the only part I wanted to add to it. That Texas is a debtor nation. It's not. If Texas succeeds from the union would be perfectly okay. But like you said, Shane, Texas has been claiming this for God knows how long. Look, I agree with you. I don't see these people who are willing to set themselves on fire for what Donald Trump did. I mean, the problem that I think some people have to deal with is this distinction between the political space and the public. And you have a lot of Republicans that look at the White House as a shining city on a hill in the way that Ronald Reagan described it. And to see people clawing, running through with zip ties and bombs and threatening the Congress members, and these pictures of Congress members scurrying, terrified, I think they have qualms with that. I honestly do. So I don't know. I have a hard time believing that Donald Trump gives this sympathy at the end of it. I think this burned his whatever legacy Donald Trump was going to have. Now, that said, if he's arrested and locked up afterwards, that's a different conversation maybe. That's a different conversation. But the way we're talking about it now, no, I don't see the sympathy for Trump. I could be wrong. We've had Republicans on this show, Republicans that have fought for Trump tooth and nail. And when this issue came up, they immediately backed away with I don't buy this. I'm not for this. Meaning there's the political winds, the political pressure wasn't there for them to take the strong stance of, yes, I'm backing Trump in this. It was the opposite. I don't think so, Tarif. I could be wrong. We could both be wrong on this, but I don't think so. We have additional callers. Brave and ATL. Brave, what's going on in Chocolate City?
Hey, what's going on, guys? How y'all feeling this morning? I got a few things. I guess I got a few things, but I guess I would start with. First of all, we're not too far. We're not too far into this thing. It seems like we are, but we've got a long road ahead of us, right? So I think we got a little bit of time to see whether Trump ends up being a martyr or just that that kicking pillow that everybody turns around and says, you know what, we should have paid close attention to what was happening to that guy. I think more than a few people will find themselves coming to that thought maybe in the next few years, because I personally am not a Trump fan, can't stand Trump, and spent many a morning and evening debating my father over Trump. But I find myself doing nothing but standing up for Trump now, and it's very frustrating. I am not a Trump supporter, but it's just ridiculous. I just want to point out, I'll throw everything else away I was going to talk about, and I will just say this. You guys had a good number of foreign policy experts on or journalists on in these last few days. And the ones that stood out the most was a Syrian girl and the people from this earlier this morning, the young woman from earlier this morning. And they talk about the insurrections, the sieges, the regime change wars that we've launched in other countries. They talk about, what it looks like, what the brutality of it really looks like. And to me, it just seems so ridiculous. Not talking about you guys specifically. I'm just saying in general, in the media in general, that we keep overblowing this flash mob as if it was actually a real siege or a real coup. They had no weapons, no means of overtaking the Capitol, holding the Capitol. You had a guy everybody keeps talking about the guy with the zip ties. Like those zip ties were ARs or something. I didn't see anybody running around with any bombs. And then the question also remains, had they had the balls to actually do something, how would they have held the seat? How would they have held the Capitol by taking selfies? So I would just ask that please, if we're going to refer to what happened, can we please at least read or play the clip of Trump's speech before and after, because no one's doing that anymore, and they're fully deplatforming him. Look at it. I am defending Trump right now. This is ridiculous. There's been a full 4-year coup, a real coup, and we talk about this protest like as if it was what we're doing in Syria, what we've done in Afghanistan and Iraq and so many other countries. I'll leave it there because I want to leave room for other people to talk, but it's just ridiculous.
No, Brave, I appreciate it, man. I guess the thing is, it wasn't just the mob. It's also Trump trying to get Pence to overturn the election results. Let's not pretend that wasn't taking place at the exact same time. Also, let's not pretend that there weren't members of Congress in the room. So it's not like the zip ties were there just for accessories. I would imagine the person is bringing those because they have the intention of taking hostages. It doesn't matter whether they can hold a Capitol or not. If they have bombs there that go off, if they're taking hostages, they can potentially injure or kill those hostages egged on from the events themselves. I don't buy the flash mob thing. And again, just because Donald Trump is doing this in the open doesn't make it any less horrific. Shane, please.
I just wanted to add this in. I agree with you, Jamarl. Brett, I believe the guest you were talking about from earlier this morning was our guest at 7:30, Vanessa Beeley, who, like she said, has been living in Syria for, I believe it was 16 months on the ground there. Longtime guest on this show, and it's great to have her back. And it was a great segment, and I'd recommend going back and checking it out and checking out her work more widely. We've got other callers, though. Nancy calling in from Florida. Nancy, you're on the line. What's going on, Nancy?
Yes, I'm calling in to take exception to the tone that everybody's using about this Trump insurrection. I think that if you try to demonize all the Trump supporters and all the people who are there to make a statement about what's going on in this country, and to think that to call them stupid, to think that somehow this election was fraudulent, when we've watched the Democrats totally demonize Trump for 4 years now with a totally false charge of this Russiagate thing. And when it got proven to be wrong, they tried to change the subject, and then they went into this this impeachment thing. And you don't think people out here are getting mad? Nobody's paying attention to what's going on out in the real world where people are really hurting. Instead, it's all this big production about Trump and trying. The Democrats are so angry that Trump beat them, and it's just been a concentrated effort to mock him and his supporters for 4 years. We got other things to worry about. This seems like, and I do feel like that this was,
one.
I feel like he played into their hands, and now they're using it to really clamp down on the rest of the country as far as.
Nancy, we got another caller, but I want to say real quick, I agree with you, frankly. I agree with at least 95% of what you said. I'm criticizing Trump here because, like you're saying, he played into their hands. And I don't think it was a good move. I think it is an impeachable offense. But I don't think that should let us be distracted from fundamentally the real issues going on in our country, which are a lot of people are suffering. We're waging unjust wars, killing people abroad and at home for no good end other than the enrichment of those who are already too rich. But we got one more caller. Got about 30 seconds here. Shelly from Michigan, you're on the line. What's going on? Maybe 20 seconds. We really got to cut it out. But Shelly, go for it.
Okay, well, just to finish off on what everyone was saying earlier about Trump and the mosh pit that happened. I mean, these people are brainwashed by him. Like, it's not like they were like, hey, we're going to go take the Capitol, but like, they were brainwashed. They were looking for a leader to take care of them because that's how our society.
Shelly, we're out of time, but I agree with you. But we got to close it here. Thank you for the call. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Have a great day. Fault Lines, signing off.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. We had a great show today. Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us as always. Today and the next few days are going to be a little weird. I have a funeral that we're going to in Richmond, my wife and I. We're going to be there until the end of the week. So, so we're going to be there for the end of the week. So the shows you may see me doing might be on like a cell phone or something like that. It may not necessarily be in my typical studio with the production and everything else. But we will do our damnedest to still bring you the shows. Fault Lines will still be aired, even though it's probably going to be on telephone for today and tomorrow. I'm sorry, it's tomorrow and day after, meaning Thursday and Friday. But we'll see. We might be able to set up an office in the hotel room itself to kind of keep this going. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I am going to say subscribe. Betray Your Soul 38. Take my dollars and keep on moving, dude. Keep it killing it, dude. Thank you for the content. Oh, I appreciate it, man. Thank you. I appreciate it. All right, guys, I'm going to end this here. You may or may not see me later today. I'm not quite sure. It depends on how this day goes. Like I said, tomorrow is my grandmother's funeral, so that's going to be a little weird. You're probably not going to see me at all. But I'll see you guys at the very least by Saturday. Thanks all.